Resuming the council meeting, we were called to order at 6 so that we could take a vote on a closed session. We have had that closed session, discussed two items. One was a negotiating strategy for the sale of two city-owned properties. That sale will be coming in before the council in an open meeting very shortly, and also had a discussion with our attorney and the attorney for Historic Tacoma and a couple of their board members on legal strategy regarding the proposed development of the Tacoma Metro. And now we are moving on with the rest of our agenda. The first item on our agenda is council comments and announcements. Are there any council comments or announcements? I wanted to report this past week I attended the annual conference of the Maryland Mayors Association. It was an extremely productive conference. We always have a very good program that's focused on legislative activity in Annapolis. The meeting is in Annapolis during the legislative session. Mayors are a very practical bunch, and we very much want to have opportunities to talk to our legislators. We always get a briefing on the MML priority issues, which are municipal revenues and annexation and growth policies, those two areas. We also have had for the last several years opportunities to discuss issues with various legislative leaders. This year we had discussions with Ulysses Curry, who's chairman of the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee, and Mike Bush, who is the Speaker of the House, who talked to us on various issues. We also this time had an invitation from Peter Francho, who chairs the Transportation Appropriation Subcommittee, to appear before his committee along with Secretary of Transportation Flanagan. Several of the monies that municipalities normally get from the Highway User Fund had not been provided in this past budget. There was a understanding between the administration and several municipalities that they would get these monies in the future, and they didn't come through. And so there were a number of mayors, I was included, very disappointed, who spoke at this hearing. And the fact that there were 12 or 15 mayors all very unhappy about this one decision by Secretary Flanagan made a number of papers, and I understand that there may be some possibility now that the governor may try and come up with some additional funding for this program. I also, while I was there, was able to attend two meetings of the Montgomery delegation on which the condo conversion bill was discussed. Mark Elrich was also at one of those meetings, and it was very helpful, particularly to have Mark there, who's very well versed in the background of these bills. And I think some progress was made, although it's still going to be an uphill discussion. I also had the opportunity to talk to 3 of our 4 delegation members. So I managed to get a fair number of things done in the 2 days that I was up in Annapolis with the Mayors Association. Any other council comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that a lot of people have sent emails or made phone calls to the delegation regarding the condo conversion bill. And I thought the emails and the phone calls were actually very helpful. Members of the delegation were aware that people were concerned, and in fact they were concerned beyond the borders of Tacoma Park. So I was very heartened by the response that we had from the broader community, and enabling us to, I think, show the committee, the delegation, that this just wasn't a Tacoma Park issue, but it was an issue of concern to many residents in the county. So anybody who has written or called so far, thank you. And if you haven't written or called, there's still time, about 2 weeks in fact.
Anyone else?
Just a couple of announcements. One is somewhat unrelated to my council duties, but just to keep the council abreast of testimony I'll be giving in Annapolis. On Wednesday, I'll be speaking for the American Public Health Association in support of a bill Sharon Grossfeld has introduced and Delegate Hubbard from Prince George's County has introduced, to make emergency contraception available over the counter through a pharmacist. And I'm happy to provide any additional information for my colleagues. They did not, unfortunately, need our Montgomery County support for this. They're looking more for Howard County support, Baltimore, Prince George's County. And so I'm working with colleagues in those jurisdictions to try and see this legislation through. The other announcement I wanted to make is about the Jackie Park parking issue. It's something that's coming up on Friday evening, I believe, and what we'll be talking about is the shortage of parking around Jackie Park, much of which is due to the construction of the Metropolitan Branch Trail. And I'm very glad we have the trail in place, but we do need to grapple with the parking issues that have come up because of that, namely on the residential streets that abut the park. There are issues with permits and 2-hour parking, and many things have been discussed. And then I believe the parking spaces across from the park on Tacoma Avenue are right now unmetered, so could be used by Metro commuters or a variety of other people instead of the intended use by people who are visiting the park. So these are just some of the things that we'll be talking about on Friday night.
Could I ask a question or follow on that?
Yeah.
I've actually had emails from people who are either in playgroups in the city, and I've sent some of them to Barbara, and people who want to bring their kids over to Jackie Park was one of the emails during the day, and there's been a discussion about the inability of residents to do things like visit other residents, that if you have a playgroup and you have 6 or 8 people coming over to visit for a couple of hours, everybody has to go down and get a permit. And if you want to go to Jackie Park, and bring a group of people over there, everybody's, it's just making this difficult. And I was wondering whether we need to, maybe after Friday night, and see how some of the issues go there, looking more broadly at, I don't think any of us ever intended with our parking policies to make it so residents couldn't visit neighbors and do the kind of things that people are doing. So I'm wondering that maybe we ought to try to get some more community input and look at some of these issues a little bit more broadly now.
Okay. Any other comments? We have no additional agenda items. I'm going to maybe ask the council's indulgence. I have not had a chance to read the minutes, although the city clerk provided them to us with sufficient notice. I just haven't had a chance to do it. I understand some other council members haven't had a chance to do it either. And so unless there's a strong feeling on the part of the council that we move forward, I would suggest that we postpone that until the next legislative meeting in 2 weeks. Okay, I'm not seeing any concerns about that, so we'll postpone for 2 weeks. The next item on the agenda is the public comment period. This is the time that's set aside for discussion on items that are not on our regular meeting agenda. That would include either work session items or items that the council is not taking up this evening. If you have a discussion on one of the items on our regular agenda, I'd ask that you'd hold your comments till we get to that item. And also, when you come forward, I'd ask if you'd identify yourself and also keep your comments to 3 minutes, and we will have a little light on the podium that will let you know when your 3 minutes are approaching and when your 3 minutes are up. Thank you. Any public comments?
Yes. Good evening, Mayor Porter and council members. My name is Ann Ludlow. I live at Victory Tower, 7051 Carroll Avenue. And I'm here tonight, first of all, to say thank you for a lot of hard work and beautiful results for the fixing up of Carroll Avenue and the improvements there. It's much more pleasant to walk without all of the bumps and the wider sidewalks, and it's also beautiful. Looking forward to spring and enjoying it even more. But my real concern tonight is the fact that a little farther up Carroll Avenue, Westmoreland intersection with Carroll Avenue is still a real problem, a real safety issue. And I think the mayor was talking a little bit about money for that just a few minutes ago. But I want very much to ask you to work in whatever ways you can through the state, the county, locally, other sources of funding to do something to get Westmoreland and Carroll Avenue intersection improved so that it will be a safe place for residents of Tacoma Park. And of course, I'm particularly interested in it because of Victory Tower. We have 190 people, including residents and workers there, many of whom need to use that intersection for important services for their lives and also just to enjoy some shopping. So whatever you can do to hurry that along and hopefully get it done in 2006 would be muchly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, and I also thank all the folks from Victory Tower for being so good about making that point so strongly to the Lieutenant Governor when he was here. It didn't result in his giving us the money, but it certainly resulted in raising the profile of that issue, and I agree with you, it's an issue of much concern to us, and it will remain so. Thank you. I neglected to mention earlier that Councilmember Clay will be a little bit late this evening. Unfortunately, the Saska Neighborhood Association, which is in her ward, set their neighborhood association meeting for the same time as the city council meeting, and so she is going to be dividing her time between that meeting and this one, so she will be here a little bit later. Are there any other public comments? All right, seeing none, we go on to the city manager's comments.
My report this evening focuses strictly on the community center project. Probably the most important thing that I have to share with the council is that we have received a formal request for mediation from James F. Knott Construction Company. As I had indicated in a prior report, my suspicion, which turned out to be true, is that the initial subject of the mediation will be certain proposed change orders involving the mechanical subcontractor PowerMax. At this juncture, that is the only items that will be the subject of the mediation. Are those items? Certainly there are a number of items that remain unresolved, and James F. Knott may elect to file for mediation on those items as well. The parties have agreed on a mediator. The projected cost of the mediation will probably be somewhere in the range of $10,000 to $15,000. Based on my discussions with Mr. Cox, he's the city's construction attorney. By contract, the cost of the mediator himself, as well as the filing fee, is shared between the parties. Like most of these type of proceedings, those costs are actually fairly minimal. Where you run into most of the cost is the preparation time. Basically, Mr. Cox's preparation time, our construction management consultant will probably be the major parties involved in that. I think on the fortunate side, we have probably done a lot of the preparation work already, basically dealing with James F. Knott and trying to resolve these issues more amicably. So obviously our intention is to try to keep the cost that we can control as low as possible. Between the schedule of Mr. Cox, the opposing counsel, as well as the mediator that we have chosen, I would not anticipate that the mediation process would get underway any sooner than 45 days. It may actually take longer than that. So obviously I'll keep you apprised as we move forward, but that is the kind of the status of those particular items at this time. Kind of moving on, in terms of the elevator, I had mentioned last week that we had given some information to TRG Construction, who is the contractor for Phase 2. That information appears to be sufficient for them to work with us on getting some pricing without any additional design fees. They do plan to have an electrician on site this week to basically look at the elevator shaft and basically try to refine the preliminary pricing they have given us. My hope is to have some more definitive pricing for you next week. That's what we're shooting for. Based on the information I have so far, it looks like we could be looking in the range of $150,000. To the best of my knowledge, that figure does not include any modifications that probably should be made to the existing elevator, as I had mentioned last week. When John Salmon, one of our residents, who's an architect specializing in accessibility issues, had examined the existing elevator, he did note that there were some modifications that he would recommend. Hopefully those items will be probably somewhat minimal in cost, but we should have more definitive pricing, if not next week, the following week for you. As you may have noticed when you came in the building, the much delayed installation of the door into the public safety lobby area did take place on Friday. There have been some questions I have received from some residents about the cost of that, and I guess just to be clear, this was part of the scope of work that we've already contracted for with TRG Construction. It was part of the kind of the master door plan, if you will. It did not represent a change order to that contract. We had merely asked TRG to expedite this work so that we could avoid having that propped open door coming off the parking lot. But I do believe it was one of Councilmember Austin Lane's constituent had a question about that.
Can you just tell me so that I can say it to him how much it did cost?
We would have to isolate it. It was part of a bigger door. I mean, it was part of the overall TRG contract, so it wasn't like there was a specific price we got for that door. We can certainly ask them that, but it was not broken out in any way. I think I had referenced that in the email I had sent to your constituent, Councilmember Austin Lane. I've not seen any response from him.
He sent back a response
He did.
asking me how much the door cost.
Yeah, I can find out. Like I say, that's not how the city's contract is delineated, so we'd have to make a specific request for that information from TRG. I'll see if we can obtain that.
Thank you.
In terms of the technical studies, which were basically the studies that the council had authorized related to the construction of a proposed gymnasium, pleased to report that the field work for the utility study is complete. I hope to have the final report from the company in hand sometime next week. Vanita George, our project manager, and I are in the process of trying to schedule a meeting with ECS, which is a company that will be doing the borings. We'd like to have that meeting on site to basically talk about the specific location where those borings should be taken, as well as the timing for that work. So the technical studies are moving ahead. Hopefully, if we're able to have that meeting arranged with ECS in the near future, I'll be able to give you a little bit more of a definitive timeline for the boring work to be done.
So when you say the field work for the utility location thing, that means that they've gone out and they've done the stuff and we're just waiting for a
Correct.
report?
Right.
Okay.
They've done their part. We just need to receive the report.
Okay, good. Thank you.
The last item that I had, which is sort of only tangentially related to the community center project itself, has to do with the roofs of the library and the municipal building. I had commented a little bit on this topic last week. As the council is aware, we had previously retained an independent roofing consultant to take a look at the roofs because of the numerous leaks that we're experiencing. As I'd also mentioned previously, we basically did request an inspection and an estimate from TRG's roofing subcontractor, and the Public Works Director, Darrell Braithwaite, and Vanita George had met with representatives from TRG, I believe it was last week, to kind of go over that proposal. Basically, the approximate cost for redoing the roofs on both the old section of the municipal building as well as the library is approximately $100,000. One of the unknowns is, which is you get involved with any roofing project, is until you start work, you don't really know if there's any kind of damage to the subroofing that may require repair. That's certainly a possibility. Based on the recommendation of Ms. Braithwaite, we have also asked the subcontractor to give us pricing for two additional areas. One is the roof over the room that we're sitting in currently, as well as a area near the plaza, which basically overhangs the old stairwell in the police department. Because of some changes in that area, we've had some periodic leaks. I don't know exactly when that information will be forthcoming. Based on the discussions we've had, I believe the roof over this section of the building is probably in better shape than what we found on top of the library, as well as the parking lot side of this building, which undoubtedly need to be replaced. At this point, there's about $40,000 included in the equipment replacement reserve that's already in place for those roofs. If we were to stop with just the areas we've identified so far, obviously that would mean that we would need approximately $60,000 additional. I'm not asking you to make a decision this evening, but we will need to make a decision very, very soon. And my recommendation at this point is that we do look to find the funding to do this. Obviously, we have had leaks in those areas before. We're continuing to have new leaks pop up, and I am seriously concerned about having some potential damage done to the space that is in the process of being renovated. It's kind of one of those unfortunate things that once you start developing roof leaks, all that tends to happen is you just have new ones developing. And I think we're just at a point with both those roof structures that they are just going to need to be replaced.
And is it your sense that that this it has to do with the community center, the new building, or is this something that we would have had to deal with?
We would have
for
had to do it
maintenance?
anyway, and that's why I mentioned at the beginning of this, introducing this item, it's only tangentially related to the
Okay.
community center project, mainly because we saw an opportunity perhaps to have the work done in a more cost-effective manner. It would not be my recommendation that the cost for any roof replacement be charged to the community center project, because I think regardless of this project, we would have had to have done it anyway. I don't know, Darrell, is there anything that I overlooked?
Terry, and then Bruce.
Thank you, Mayor Porter. Yes, I recall in 1999, in fact, I think during a council meeting, the roof was leaking here, so that was well before the community center construction began. I'm just interested in the process. I was a little confused on the process that you're using for getting bids on this, and is this strictly using the current contractor, or are you going out to getting three bids?
At this point, what we've done is, as I mentioned, we did hire an independent roofing consultant. The estimate that he had actually given us, I believe, was in the approximate range of $350,000, is what he estimated this work to be valued at. Obviously, TRG is equally concerned about the roof condition because they're identifying new leaks as they're going through the spaces and working. We have just spoken to them at this point in terms of trying to piggyback onto the existing contract. I do have some level of comfort that what they're quoting is reasonable, particularly given the estimate that we've been given by the independent roofing consultant.
Okay, thank you.
Would it be possible for you to give us any general time sense on the remaining PCOs with Phase 1 that aren't involved at this point in the process you talked about earlier? I'm just wondering when we might finally have some resolution on those so we have a clearer picture of what money we need to expend and what we've got left for other things, or how it relates to all those other phases.
Yeah, we're in the process of putting together a financial report to give you later this month. Obviously, there were a number of items that I had reported on previously, which will be processed as Change Order 25. What I can do for you next week, I actually was going to hope to carve out some time today and do this for you. I just ran out of time, is to give you the list of the PCOs as it stands today, removing the ones that have already been agreed upon as Change Order 25, which would give you the remaining items that are unresolved and highlight those that are the subject of mediation. I think we really are at a point where the parties are somewhat a little bit at a stalemate on many of the items. We have spent, I think, considerable time and expense trying to be fair and analyzing the items, working with both the architect and with Sharon Consulting. Obviously, there is a point when you're going through these kind of matters that you don't want to needlessly expend funds on legal action, and you have to make a calculated decision in terms of what you think the outcome of those proceedings might be versus the cost of going through mediation and potentially arbitration. I will say, with the items that are currently the subject of mediation, the parties are very far apart in terms of what we believe is reasonable and the offer we have made and what essentially the subcontractor through James F. Knott is demanding. And that variance is so significant that I do feel comfortable that the mediation process is the right way to go. On the other items, we'll just have to wait and see. There were a number of items that we had reported back to James F. Knott on in January. I believe their process is to take the city's offer, send it back out to the subcontractors, and to await their response whether or not they are willing to accept that offer or reject it. And we've not heard back from James F. Knott in terms of all those items.
So it sounds like under a best-case scenario, they could be resolved relatively soon. Under a worst-case scenario, it's open-ended.
I think that's true. I think the items, and I can double-check the figures very quickly, the items that are the subject of mediation, I can find it real quickly, Councilmember Williams, I believe, total just a little over $113,000. As I mentioned, I think even being optimistic is the right word when you're talking about mediation, but I don't think that the mediation process will even get underway at the earliest in 45 days. My guess it could actually be 2 months out. So in terms of that particular group of items, unless there is a change in feeling on the part of James F. Knott and their subcontractor PowerMax, those items will probably be in play for months yet.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like we can assume that both groups could be in play for months.
I think that's a fair statement. I would say these are the group of items that I have suspected for some time would end up in some type of mediation or arbitration proceeding, just because the parties have been so far apart. The other items were a little bit closer, and as I mentioned, we're still awaiting formal notification from NOD of where their subcontractors stand on the city's latest offer.
Okay. Thank you.
Barb, I'd just like to reassure the residents of the city that the city has, in fact, done everything within its power to settle these disputes amicably. And unfortunately, in the instances that you described, it just wasn't possible. And further, I'd like to add that you and the city staff have been particularly effective in documenting things since you came on. And the level of preparation that you have shown as you have attempted to mediate on your own these differences of opinion have been stellar. And you have shown that in many instances, because you have the documentation, that you have been able to settle a lot of these disputed change orders, in some cases for 50 cents on the dollar. So, no one here would want to expend further the public treasury needlessly, but I think it's important that we assure people that we're going into this with our eyes wide open, with the knowledge that we have attempted to resolve things earlier, and well prepared to prevail in this case, as I'm sure we'll be able to do. So I just wanted to thank you for the tremendous preparation that you and the staff have brought to the table here. I think it far exceeds the level of preparation that I have seen on the part of the contractor. And though I certainly wouldn't want to make any predictions, I feel quite confident that we'll be able to prevail to the extent that anyone prevails in these things, given the costs of bringing it in such a formal proceeding as a mediation.
No, I appreciate your comments, Councilmember Berry. I think certainly those of us who have been involved on the city's part, including Mr. Cox, Mr. Petro, Benita George, and myself, I think have always had the goal of trying to resolve these issues in an amicable fashion. I do think there reaches a point where the demands that have been made upon us, in our opinion, are just unreasonable, and you do try to factor in what you're going to expend in terms of mediation cost and where that's going to end up against what the person is demanding. I think in this particular group of proposed change orders, unfortunately, we're just very far apart. We have been, and we've just reached a point where we just can't seem to work out the issues. I would just comment that a mediation is just that. It is a mediation. It is not binding on either party. And so we'll just kind of have to wait and see how that plays out. The contract obviously does provide for arbitration if the parties are unable to resolve their issues after going through mediation. So in response to Councilmember Williams' question, this could, some of these issues could still be in play for some time to come. I do recognize and appreciate the fact that that makes it very difficult for all of us, particularly the council, in terms of making certain decisions relative to this project. And that's certainly never been the staff's intention. But in all good conscience, at least with this group of proposed change orders, quite frankly, I cannot recommend in any way, shape, or form that we settle for what has been offered as a means of resolving these issues.
Thank you. I appreciate that information. The next item on the agenda is a discussion, is a single reading ordinance, a proposed single reading ordinance regarding the street improvements, the contractor for street improvements.
Move it.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved in second. Would you like to hear what it is? I think we've got... I think it would be helpful to those who don't have the material in front of us if we get the 30-second version of what's involved here. We need to reassure, even if we know that we're being responsible, we need to assure the public that we are.
we could just say, I'm here from the government, trust me.
That would really work well with our constituents.
Not an election year.
This ordinance you have in front of you here is to award a contract for the provision of what we call indefinite quantities, which translates into our street restoration, some stormwater work, anytime we have concrete or asphalt work done within the city. This technique that the city uses is a way to have a multi-year contract with very competitive prices and enables us to do work on a project-by-project basis rather than, as you have in some contract situations, you spell out exactly what it is you want done in a certain time frame and then you get a price for that. Because of the nature of our work with street restoration, the nature of funding of our work, if we can have a multi-year contract that generally spells out the parameter of a foot of curb or a ton of asphalt, then whatever the size of the project, the contractor agrees to hold to that item price multiplied by however many of the units that are put in use. So it allows maximum flexibility as well as a very clear way to determine what the costs are going to be, because we can then take the unit cost, go out to a site, do the measurements, and know what the cost of a project will be so we know ahead of time whether we have funding. The process that we used for getting this recommendation for contract award is the same one we've used multiple times in the past. We put out a request for proposals from any firms that are interested. It's advertised. It's sent out specifically to those firms that we know provide these kind of services. We have a certain deadline whereby they have to get the proposal in. This time we received 8 bid responses, which I think is the most I can remember receiving. So it was very competitive. There was a lot of interest in it. And in the end, the company that gave the best price happened to be the company that we've worked with in the past, VMP. And we also received a fairly responsive bid, though slightly higher, from the company that was the previous vendor that supplied our services. Because we are a small city and sort of a small fish in terms of these kinds of work, it's a challenge to get competitive prices. This company that we've worked with in the past tends to kind of specialize in our types of work, although they do take on larger projects as well. But they can handle sort of the rigors and the expectation of what we have, be it a small job, just a couple of squares of concrete sidewalk, or a major job where we're resurfacing, several streets, as we have been doing over the past couple of years with the loan.
How do the asphalt prices compare and concrete prices? How are they comparing to last year?
They are approximately 8 years in the case of the concrete prices, and 8% and 12% in terms of the asphalt prices higher than our lowest bidder. So it's just comparing it to the...
Just 8 to 12% more than last year.
I noticed that in the bids you got, you included having the state do the work for us. Is that what it is? Is that what state is?
No, state is the name of a firm.
Okay, thank you. That was my question.
Right.
And I'm very happy with the results of the bidding in terms of looking at all of the comparisons of the bids. The only thing that struck me a little bit was where the range of prices on the couple of the last items, which is the root zone pruning, the tree wraps, and seeding and mulching, where the contractor that we have been using and that we propose to continue using is significantly lower than a lot of the prices from the other contractors. And I'm just wondering, I'm assuming that they're comfortable enough and familiar enough with what we require, but it just struck me as a little odd that I would think that, in my experience, the types of protections that we're looking for probably go a little above and beyond what some other jurisdictions might require. And I'm wondering whether you think that other bidders who didn't necessarily have the experience, therefore, because of that sense, if they got that sense, put the price higher, and the contractor that we've been using knows exactly what's required and therefore could put a realistic price on it, or whether their prices are still a little low, whether there's been any difficulty in that area, and it's going to be continued because of they're not wanting to do the level of work that we want at the price that they've bid. Do you have a sense for whether either one of those is the case?
I most definitely don't. As a matter of fact, as a confessor, I really don't have that much of a handle on what the real technical procedure in route planning is. What I understand is that EMP has performed satisfactorily in a few cases that I have been exposed to in that regard. And I would tend to think that your latter assumption of their familiarity with the procedure has, not only on this item but on most other items, has caused them to actually have a better realistic price. You're right, there is a wide range, and I would tend to think that the other firms have really no idea of what it really entails, and that's the element of familiarity. In effect, that would be my guess.
I hope that's the case.
We'll keep an eye on it to make sure that's the case.
So DMP has had this contract up till now. Well, when did we award the contract previously, and how long was that?
As my understanding is that they have had it. They have been working with the city for approximately 6 years.
And it was 2 different contract terms, 2 3-year contracts.
And I know at one point we had 2 contractors working at the same time.
That I don't recollect, but it could have been the NZI and the VM. Oh, yes,
Right,
we did, right, when we had the county, right, when we had the county money for the annexed area and we were doing the streets. Yeah, there was too much work at that point and too short a time span, so we brought in 2 firms.
Okay, and as I recall, the DMP then was the contractor that we had at the time that we took out the bond for the road maintenance. And that contract is now terminating, is what you're saying?
It ended in November of last year.
Okay, and this is a replacement with the same contract. All right, thank you.
We have a practice of going out and rebidding it periodically, just as a matter of course. Any other questions? Okay, this single reading ordinance has been moved and seconded. Any additional council comments? Any public comments? Seeing none, since this is a single reading ordinance, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Porter?
Aye.
Councilmember Austin Lane?
Aye.
Councilmember Barry?
Aye.
Councilmember Clay? Councilmember Elridge?
Aye.
Councilmember Stevens?
Aye.
Councilmember Williams?
Aye.
The ordinance passes, the single reading ordinance passes. Next item on the agenda is another single reading ordinance for a contract for uniform rental and cleaning.
Second.
That one has also been moved and seconded. I don't know who is preparing to talk to us about that. Okay.
Yeah, it's the Public Works uniform.
Okay.
Again, as per the union contract, we're required to provide uniforms for a certain class of employees. We do that through providing a company that does the rental of the uniforms as well as the cleaning of the uniforms. And we have a locker room that establishes the storage of those uniforms. We've got up to 28 people on the Public Works staff that use uniforms, are required to wear uniforms. I was made aware of a contract that Anne Arundel County had competitively bid with a company named Cintas. In looking at the prices that were available, they were significantly less than the prices we were currently paying with our contractor. So we've been in contact with them now for several months to get the process underway and get the paperwork back and forth to see the specifics of the bid award. And it's my recommendation that we go ahead and shift vendors to provide the same uniforms and the same kind of service that we currently provide at a significant savings to the city over time. This contract is has a one-year term with the ability to extend it for an additional year. We tend to keep our uniform companies for multi-year, in the 6 to 8 year range. Historically, there is a lot of ups and downs in the uniform contract biz, and so it seems to me like every 6 or 8 years or so we get fed up and change companies. We've used Cintas in the past, and we've stopped Cintas in the past, and now we're back with them again, or recommending that we go back with them again.
Terry?
I don't recall seeing this contract come before the council in the past, has it?
No, not that I can recall. We've been with another company for many, many years, and I don't remember the specifics of what happened when that uniform contract shifted from Cintas, I believe, to the company we have currently. So I'd have to look back. I don't have a recollection of it.
It may have been that it came up prior to the council's establishing of the limit of $10,000 for things that could be done without council action. So maybe it was done administratively.
Yeah, I'd have to look back through the records. I don't have a specific recollection.
Yeah, seems puzzling. Thank you.
Any other questions?
The prices have also increased over time, so it may have been, the prices were less then and didn't trigger the council approval.
Just an observation, I'm not sure that I've calculated it correctly, but I know in the fiscal impact, talk about a approximate savings of $3,500 over a one-year period. Does that include things other than just this unit price that you've given us?
No, it just includes those compared to what we're paying now. Because we've been with this company for so long, we have employees in different cost scales. So I have one employee getting the exact same amount of uniforms, but because they've been here, 10 plus years, they're charged at a different price than the current company, the current person that starts right now is charged at a higher price. So overall, the savings would be at least that and probably more.
Just because when I did a quick and dirty, I came up with $1,500, not $3,500.
Oh, yeah, it's.
But I'm not going to worry about the difference, but it struck me.
We're saving money.
I know, yes, and that's fine.
Saving money is good, as long as we can get good quality service.
Well, I am sure that we will, initially, every contract is very good for the first year or so, and then it starts getting a little sloppy.
Well, we have the ability to change.
Right. That's one of the things I find attractive about the short term. They're going to be kind of constantly on their toes.
Okay. We've got this in front of us. Are there any additional council questions or comments? Are there any public comments on this single reading ordinance? All right, seeing none, would the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Porter?
Aye.
Councilmember Austin Lane?
Aye.
Councilmember Barrett?
Aye.
Councilmember Clay? Councilmember Elrich?
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens?
Aye.
Councilmember Williams?
All right.
The ordinance also passes. The next item on the agenda is a single reading ordinance regarding a contract for customer service training. I think this must be
when the city manager submitted her budget last year, we had indicated in the budget that we wanted to do customer service training through this year, and we put funds in the non-departmental training to cover that. We went out with proposals, sent packets to 8 different vendors, got 3 back. 2 of them we really don't feel are very responsive. They were giving a lot less training. That's why the difference in the price. They were given 2-hour classes. We specifically asked that we wanted a lengthy class up to 8 hours to cover all the aspects and to have practical exercises as part of the training. Neither of those 2 vendors that we rejected indicated that they had that. We were also very impressed with the list of references they provided, and we checked a couple of the cities where they have done this training, and they were very pleased and have repeatedly used these people. So we're asking the council to approve this in the amount of $28,535. And the one addendum to this that was not included in either of the other 2 bids also was that we wanted them to train at least 3 of our people as trainers so that we could continue this training for new employees and to conduct refresher training as required. And this proposal does have that.
That's certainly an important thing, as we've had issues with that in the past. Would someone like to?
Move it. Can I make a few comments?
Yes, it's been moved and seconded.
Just a couple comments. I like the idea of this. I think your recommendation is a good one. And all I wanted to comment on is that I noticed a couple things in looking through their proposal that just take them for what they're worth. I thought they're right up on pages 2 and 3. They must have done a lot of cut and pasting because it didn't read very well. I thought their editing was sloppy, including writing their own company name without capitalization. But the main thing that struck me was that there was one place on page 2 under objectives in the executive overview. Objective C is, they said the training process includes a train-the-trainer solution for 2 internal trainers. And then a number of other places they said 3.
It is 3.
So I wanted to make sure that it's 3 and that it's just their sloppiness that put it to 2.
When they costed out the project, they were showing 3.
Okay. And I do like the fact that they have the program customization for the materials and things. So I think it's generally a good proposal. I was happy to see the recommendations from the other jurisdictions that have used it. I just wish they had cleaned up their proposal a bit more. And tell them I said so.
I'll tell them.
What exactly is the customization? How are they proposing to?
They're going to sit down with us and figure out what our needs are, and then tailor it toward the police department, tailor it probably the classes for the public works employees, and that type of customization.
Now, do we as a city have certain mission statements or value statements? That
we do. We have a customer service policy.
Right, because I think that would be an excellent.
They'll incorporate that also into the training.
Okay. Yeah, because the problem I have with things that appear to be off the shelf is that they are off the shelf. Therefore, the more we can customize to the sort of special requirements of the city, the better, of course, it will be. And that includes, understanding who the customer is, which in this city is maybe different than other places. So that would be a key part of it.
Both the references that we talked to indicated that they were very pleased with how they worked with the staff and tried to cover the issues that they wanted covered.
And is there any way that we can measure the progress of this?
There is, and they're going to give us some tools to the supervisors can go back and measure how well it's taken place. They had an option to do a pre-survey and an after survey of the employees and whatnot to see what the attitudes were. I took it out because they wanted $10,000 for it, and I hadn't asked for that.
Okay, because we after they're gone, we could take a look at what they use as metrics, and maybe we could add some of our own. And then every quarter we could take a look and see how we're doing. So I might ask, as a condition for support on this, that you would come back to us after the training, share the metrics with us, and we'd have an opportunity to discuss that and see where we take it from there.
I wanted to add one additional thing, and this is about the program customization. They said they're interested in getting information from Tacoma Park leaders on issues that should be included. One of the critical things that I hear from residents all the time is phone calls not getting returned. And there are some departments, and I'm looking at Daryl. Daryl's sort of a stellar example of a person who returns phone calls immediately. There are some departments where that doesn't happen, and they know who they are. But we really need, that's one thing that we very much need to work on.
Okay, well, I'll pass that on.
Sorry, Terry.
Thank you, Mayor Porter. I'd like to follow up on Councilmember Berry's comments and say that, I agree that that having some way to assess how well we're doing is going to be important. I think it's not even just among staff members that we want to survey, but we also want to know how the community views the customer service, because that is the customer. And it might be that we could include some assessment of perceptions in the community if we do the survey that we've talked about doing for city services. One of the services we provide is customer service, the way that we interact with the community. So it would be nice to include that in that survey and move ahead with that. And then I would also say that being able to measure is an important thing. When Mayor Porter mentioned, the frequent complaints that we get of people not returning phone calls, I think it speaks not just to training, but it speaks to management. And I think that I would be interested to hear what changes are going to be made at the managing of staff members so that people will be held accountable to use the training after we provide it.
You're looking for an answer now?
Certainly.
Well, I mean, as far as management's concerned, there's a customer service goal in all our managers' evaluation, and they're all rated on that on an annual basis. The assessment and continuation, I also try to set up I will set up some kind of an assessment tool and come back to you all once we've completed the training, and I feel certain that we can include that in the survey when we get around to that.
I may just mention that obviously some of the council members had shared their concern about phone calls not being returned or emails not being responded to. I do have a monthly meeting with all the members of the management team. I believe it might have been last month or the month before that I did flag this as an issue and a concern that the council had, and asked that all the department heads basically go back to their staffs and basically just remind them of what the customer service policy requires.
I thank you, and I'm glad to see that we are having training. I think the majority of the staff does treat our customers very well, but I think that we have seen enough concern that getting the training in place is important, but also following through with reviews and holding people accountable is also important. Thank you.
Any other council questions, comments? Are there any public comments on this ordinance? Okay. The ordinance on the customer service training is before the council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Austin Lane. Aye. Councilmember Barrett.
Aye.
Councilmember Clay. Councilmember Elridge.
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens.
Aye.
Councilmember Williams.
Aye.
The ordinance passes, single reading ordinance passes. The next item on the agenda is the first reading of the fourth budget amendment for this fiscal year.
You can stay right where you are, Darrell. Basically, the items that are included in this budget amendment involve transfers within the general fund. Darrell was coming up to the table for a follow-up item, which I think is next on the agenda. As the council probably recalls, we previously had some problems with some sewage pumps in the basement of this building. I recall reporting to you that we addressed that on an emergency basis. Basically, the city received payment from its insurance carrier, the Local Government Insurance Trust, in June of 2005. And basically, we have waited to make the repairs in those areas. We basically need to replace some baseboards, some carpeting, and things of that nature until we got through the community center construction, because we really had no place to move staff, quite frankly. Until the construction was done, we are now in a position basically to go ahead and move forward with those repairs, and the next item on the agenda will basically involve the award of a contract to have these repairs effectuated. As I mentioned, we did receive payment in the prior fiscal year. There are no funds specifically included in the FY06 budget basically for this project, and therefore it necessitates an amendment to this year's budget. It basically is kind of a timing difference between when we got payment from the insurance company and when the work is actually being done. So the amendment that is before you this evening would basically transfer funds from the unappropriated reserve to the Public Works Department budget. The second item is something that the council had talked about just a little shy of a month ago. The Safe Roadways Committee had appeared before you recommending that the city undertake certain projects of a transit nature. There were no funds specifically included in the budget for that purpose, and after some discussion, the council agreed on January 17th to transfer the $25,000 that is included currently in the city's capital budget for infrastructure improvements related to pedestrian safety, and to use those funds in more of an operating basis. And as I had indicated in mid-January, that would basically require a budget amendment to move the funds from the capital CIP basically to an operating budget. So those are basically the two items that are covered before the amendment, that are covered in the amendment before you this evening. Because they both involve transfers within the general fund, there is no change in overall fund expenditures. It's just merely a matter of moving money within the general fund.
If I can get clarification on two things. On the it's kind of hard to do. I think I'll have to move. On the first item, on the restoration of the damage, I hear you and I see the language, but I'm still not clear on whether the no change in the bottom line is only because the unappropriated reserve is within the general fund. So that, would it be fair to say that in putting together the current budget, the need to specifically set aside money for this, having already received it, was kind of overlooked? Or this is the standard way of doing it? It's essentially a lowering of our flexibility.
That's correct. That's correct. There's two different ways that you handle reserve funds. Technically, if you read the charter, it does not require that 2% be budgeted on an annual basis. What it requires is that those funds be set aside and basically held in reserve. The practice of this city and this council has been to go ahead and budget those funds. I would probably need to defer to Ms. Braithwaite in terms of the rationale or what happened in terms of, the money kind of coming in from legit, and in terms of the project not being specifically budgeted in Public Works. I think I would need to refer to Darrell. You are correct, Councilmember Williams, that it is a transfer because of the way the city has chosen to handle the unappropriated reserve, or the 2%. If the city chose to handle that in a different manner, then essentially it would require essentially a more formal drawdown of the reserve, if you will, and would probably not constitute a transfer. It would actually be an outright appropriation.
My understanding at this point is that it was more of an oversight, because two different departments generally handle insurance-related things, and this was fairly unique in that we weren't addressing it right away. So because of the long lapse in time, the staff that normally deal with the insurance issues and us that normally deal with the repairs just didn't have our wires connected on moving the money into the next year.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that I had a clear understanding of how it was affecting our bottom line. Even though it was shifting within the same fund, it cuts down on the flexibility and the options that we have for appropriating later in the fiscal year. And my second point is, I'll say it's a shame on me on this one. On the $25,000 for the safe roadways stuff, I know the mayor was fairly pointed in her comments as we had the work session on this, saying, now, is everybody happy with this? Is this what we want to do? I think it was fairly late in the evening, and I'll confess to being brain dead and half asleep at that point. But I would just like to, at this point, say that I would have been happier if we had come up with $15,000 on kind of reserve judgment on the other 10. I don't remember exactly the details of that discussion, but I just wanted to put it out there that if any of my colleagues feel like they were in the same position and wanted to only go with the 15 at this point in time, I'd be happy to have some company.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think one of the items that they had discussed with us or presented to us late in the evening And I certainly don't want to diminish at all the year's worth of effort that they put into this and coming up with their recommendations, but one of them was for some boxes to go on the transit or the bus stop signs, which would have literature in them. And I was a little concerned about that, thinking that they would end up strewn all over the place and not serve the purpose that they were intended. So until we can take, and then I think another condition of that is that they were going to go to the ride-on folks and see if they would be willing to make a contribution to that, and that hasn't occurred yet. So I think I would agree that if we could hold 10,000 of that in reserve, it would be the prudent thing to do.
And if I could just add that tweaked my memory, that I thought, yes, it was good that they said that it was a pilot project, but I thought it could have been a much smaller pilot project until we get a firm answer from Ride-On on what they could do, since it would seem to me that that's their duty to provide that. It's, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. It's their system, they want riders, but it's also our constituents who need the access to the service.
So am I understanding your proposal, and I don't believe this has been moved yet, if I'm understanding your proposal, it was to make it 15 rather than 25, and to not provide any of the money for the bus stop thing until we get, until we at least have a conversation with Ride-On and as to their willingness to participate? Is it, or is it one or the other?
I guess my sense was that there was, I was perfectly happy to go forward with a small pilot project, but my recollection is that the amount of money for that was a large chunk of the money that we're talking about.
It was like 18 or something.
And so that if we limit it to 15 and say it was the other pieces and a small amount not to exceed
Whatever's left.
Yeah, would go toward that, and that we would certainly revisit the opportunity to do more once a result has come back from their discussions or somebody's discussions with Ride-On about how we might partner with them.
Is there, I see two council members with an interest in that. Is there anyone else who has an interest in doing that? I think that's a prudent thing. Address a question to the city manager. If the council wished to do that, what would be the proper way to deal with that? Would it be to deal with it in the budget amendment or to deal with it in another fashion?
Probably a two-part question. One is if the council's desire is to hold back, if you will, $10,000 and leave it in its present budgeted location, then what you would need to do is basically direct me to amend the ordinance that is before you and basically change the anywhere it mentions 25,000 and to change that to 15,000. I would just mention, not advocating one way or another, that probably $10,000 to do any type of pedestrian safety-related infrastructure improvements, it's probably going to be very difficult. It's really not going to buy you anything. I think that's a different question, though, than what I hear on the table, which is just a concern about essentially taking on Ride-On's responsibility. So that's the technical thing you would need to do, obviously, as a matter of courtesy. If the council goes in this direction this evening, we'll be in contact with the members of the Safe Roadways Committee tomorrow just to let them know that the council has had a change of thought. This is a matter of courtesy.
I remember there was some discussion with them. I remember I asked them specifically the question as to whether they were tied to the figure that they had given us, and they said no, the figure they had given us was basically what was left out of the 25.
Yeah, I think I'm going totally off memory here, which is always kind of a dangerous thing, but my recollection is of the proposal they brought before the council, the installation of the boxes, if you will, at the various bus stops was really the vast majority of what their proposal was. For some reason, either $11,000 or $14,000 is sticking in my head, and I'm not sure which of those figures is correct. But it was the majority of the funding that the Safe Roadways Committee was seeking.
Right, but they did say that the reason they had picked the number that they had picked is because it was what was left in the 25 after they had allocated the monies for the previous two items.
So I guess if I could move it with the substitution of 15 for 25 and to convey to the Safe Roadways Committee that our understanding is that still leaves some money in there for this particular aspect of the project, and that we would like them to come back after they've consulted with they or whoever the appropriate people are have consulted with Ride-On, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, and since this is a two-reading ordinance, if they have a concern, they would have opportunity to contact us prior to second reading.
I'm sorry, I can't support that amended introduction. I'd like to see it amended, I'd like to see it introduced as is, and then if you would like to have a vote on that amendment.
The person who introduced it with the 15,000. If you wish to change it, you could propose an amendment to take it back to 25. Have we had a second on the proposal?
Second.
Okay, it has been moved and seconded in terms. So if you wish to amend it back to the 25, you could propose that as an amendment.
Well, just so my colleagues know, I'll be voting against this, not because it's a bad idea to be fiscally responsible and keep our budget in order, but because it's a really bad idea to wait until the citizens group is no longer in front of us to pull a stealth move. If that's how you want to do it, fine, I'll just vote against it.
Okay. Is there any other council discussion? Is there any public discussion? As I said, there will be an opportunity for additional public discussion on second reading. All right, I don't see anyone. All in favor of this amendment at first reading, please say aye.
Wait a minute.
Aye.
I said amendment.
I'm sorry. The budget amendment number
Okay.
4 is what I meant. Thank you for getting the clarification. What's on the table right now is the budget amendment number 4 to the fiscal 06 budget, which was moved with 15,000 rather than 25,000 by Councilmember Williams and seconded by Councilmember Siemens. That's what's on the table right now. And this is the first reading. There will be a second reading in addition to this reading. All those in favor of this item at first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
All right. It's been recorded with 1 nay. It passes with 1 nay, and there will be a second reading on this item. The next item on the agenda is a contract for, or ordinance awarding a contract for the restoration of the damage that was discussed in the previous item. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Okay. Do you want to know what this is?
No.
Well,
Is it for the good of the city?
do you want to give us 30 seconds on what this is?
Very quickly, this is doing a renovation, if you will, a cleanup of an area that was damaged due to the sewage pump failure in December of 2005. It's a modest amount of work, taking out 2 feet of drywall from the bottom of the walls, replacing the baseboard, doing some sanitation of the tiles, and replacing carpets. Actually, all the carpets were removed, so this is just putting new carpets back in those areas. The staff that will be affected, I think it's a total of 7 people, will be moving them into the trailer on Grant Avenue and into the council conference room, is my understanding. The work is expected to last 4 to 6 weeks, and then they'll be moved back.
And the amount of the bid that we're awarding for is $16,732.49, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And this had to go through the insurance, claims adjuster's office and be approved, and they haggled it out. This is the base of the base bid.
Okay. Is there any additional council comment? Terry?
I'm just curious, this isn't the first time that the basement's flooded down there, is it?
No, we've had at least 3 floods that I'm aware of. This is the first one that was due to the sewage pump failure. Those pumps have been replaced, and we now have a double alarm system related to those. So it shouldn't be a cause again.
Okay, so you've implemented new safeguards to try to minimize the chances of this happening again. And do you think we've, at this point, resolved the stormwater problem?
I think that would be, I guess, a question for Ali. I just don't know the detail of the stormwater issues related to this particular building and whether or not that includes new construction or the old part. I don't have the background.
Okay, thank you.
Are there additional questions? Okay. Any council comments? Any public comments on this ordinance? All right, this is a 2-reading ordinance, so all those in favor of the ordinance at first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Ordinance passes at first reading. The next is a second reading of the ordinance we discussed previously on the contract for the wage and survey and compensation study.
I'd just like to make one correction that when I introduced this last week, I said that the last study was done in 1999. It was actually done in 1997. and we used it as the basis for designing the pay system which the council enacted in 1999.
Okay, so the study was actually done in 1997, which was almost 10 years ago.
And unless there's further questions, it's just a second reading.
I had questions about the council compensation.
Okay, does somebody want to move this, just to put it on the table?
Move it.
Okay, so, okay, it's been moved and seconded. Joy? Did you? It's been moved and seconded.
Yes, I think I asked my question, so.
Yeah, I think at the last meeting, Councilmember Austin Lane had asked about council compensation. I think what we had talked about was that this study, because of kind of the way it's structured, was probably not the most appropriate way to get at that issue. The city clerk did go back and review, I don't know if it was a resolution or an ordinance from the study that had been done previously. It does call for that work to be updated, I think, Jesse, every 4 years. Is that correct? So it is time, actually, for the council to convene another committee to basically review council compensation. And basically, we'll be talking to the mayor in terms of how to proceed with that issue. But based on the schedule that had been adopted before, Councilmember Austin Lane would be correct that it is time to look at that issue again.
Any other questions?
Will that be added to the agenda?
Yes. And we're figuring out when we could do that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any public comments on this ordinance at second reading? All right, seeing none. This is the second reading of the ordinance. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Porter.
Aye.
Councilmember Austin Lane.
Aye.
Councilmember Barry.
Aye.
Councilmember Clay. Councilmember Elridge.
Aye.
Councilmember Stevens.
Aye.
Councilmember Williams.
Aye.
This ordinance passes at second reading. The next item on the agenda is a second reading of the ordinance amending the city code to expand the membership of the Emergency Preparedness Committee. Are you doing this one too, Wayne?
Yes, we incorporated, the last time the mayor recommended some changes to the language in the ordinance, and that has been incorporated into the ordinance.
Move it. Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? I think we've discussed this at least a couple of times in the past. All right, is there any public comments on this ordinance at second reading? All right, seeing none, would the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Porter.
Aye.
Councilmember Austin Lane.
Aye.
Councilmember Barry.
Aye.
Councilmember Clay. Councilmember Elridge.
Aye.
Councilmember Stevens.
Aye.
Councilmember Williams.
Aye.
The ordinance passes at second reading. And then the final item on our legislative regular meeting agenda this evening is to make a couple of appointments to the Emergency Preparedness Committee
Move it.
that we just modified to make 2 appointments.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and second. We should probably say that there have been, I believe, 3 people who have applied to the committee whose applications are still outstanding. And I think the council was very impressed by the qualifications of these 2 appointees because of their professional backgrounds in the areas that we thought would be particularly useful on this committee. And there are a number of other people in the community who have expressed interest and who have had a lot of participation in the community. And certainly, we would hope that those who were not appointed to the committee would continue to be involved and are more than welcome to attend meetings and to be part of the process. And we're very grateful for all of the people who put their names into the committee and who were willing to participate. So, would someone like to move this resolution?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any additional council comments or questions? Any public comments on the resolution? This appoints Sharon Burke and Melanie Collins to the Emergency Preparedness Committee. Seeing no public comments, all those in favor of the resolution, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Resolution passes. The council will take a short recess now and come back for our 2 work session items. The next item is a work session discussion, a continuation of a previous discussion. We had a discussion some weeks ago about the council's interest in putting together committees of residents to deal with, I guess, two specific issues. And where we ended up was with the idea we would have one committee for each issue rather than trying to combine them in a single committee. The first issue was a concern about the provision of medical services. With the move of the hospital, the provision of medical services to the community. And the second one was, with the assumption that the hospital was moving, what would happen with the site the hospital is currently located at. And so with the decision that we would have two separate committees to deal with those two separate issues, we should now go ahead and talk about what the structure of the two committees would look like and who, not necessarily names, but functions we would like to have on those two different committees. I've done some thinking about the second committee, not so much the first one, since that time, the issue of the redevelopment of the site. And there were a couple of issues that were put on the table in the first discussion that I think we could accommodate both. One was a concern about the community as a whole having a legitimate concern about what was happening with that site in terms of traffic impacts. And the other is that the neighborhoods immediately surrounding the hospital had a very specific and special concern about what went on that site. And in the past, we have accommodated that type of thing in our other discussions. For example, when we talked about the siting for the community center, we gave the neighborhoods immediately around the site special consideration since they would be closest to it. And I think it would be quite possible to put together a committee which would include both a representative of each ward and then, in addition to that, representatives of each of the immediately adjacent neighborhoods that would balance the concerns about the needs of the entire community with the special concerns of the residents of the immediate neighborhoods. That might be a way to deal with that.
I want to thank the mayor for making this a priority and getting it on the agenda so quickly. I'm glad that we're discussing this again, and I think it's even more timely now that our ladder truck is being discussed yet again. So I think this group that we can put together should be representative of all of Tacoma Park, as the mayor has suggested, as well as the neighborhoods that are adjacent to the hospital, and should have a fairly broad scope of talking about health service in the city, both from the fire and rescue standpoint as well as the hospital and other healthcare facilities.
Actually, my suggestion was to the second of the committees which dealt with the redevelopment of the site. But I would agree with your concerns about the first one, which is the discussion of health care services for the community also.
I'm a little confused because you're talking about the relocation of the ladder truck. I take it in your comments about the fire department, right? Mm-hmm. And that seems to me to have like immediate urgency, whereas we're talking about something that's going to happen over a period of time in terms of developing a healthcare response that I think has a longer time frame for us to come up with, solutions or things we want to say. Whereas I think the ladder truck we need to address like immediately, if not sooner.
And we don't have a citizens group that can address that with us. So the sooner we get a healthcare committee, the better off we'll be.
Right, but I think we can certainly address the ladder truck issue in advance of that committee.
We as a council can do that, and hopefully the organization of a community group will follow soon after.
Does the council have, assuming that we are where we left it at the last meeting with two separate committees, does the council have thoughts about putting together the committee that would deal with health care issues? I think what we had on the table, and we didn't make any decisions the last time, was the notion that we would include people from across the city, and then there was some discussion of specific organization or institutions that should also be included. I believe there was mention of both Tacoma Towers and the Franklin as entities that might have specific concerns about health care issues. Are there other entities that we would also include?
I don't know if these are entities, but it seemed to me that we might want to look for people who had any kind of public health expertise. People who can look at data and look at the population and the issues that that I think are going to be raised, and not just respond as lay people who maybe bring some expertise to the table. And it's hard to imagine that we don't have people with that skill here. We probably do.
So am I understanding your suggestion that you're suggesting that rather than trying to appoint someone from each ward perhaps for this first group, that we try and cover the organizations that have been suggested, plus look for people from wherever in the city who have specific expertise in that area?
I guess it's hard for me on the healthcare issue to think that any ward has any special or more legitimate concern than anybody else does. We all share a concern about adequate health care and accessibility. And, I'm happy to have the most qualified people and the most interested people, involved in this. And if it's a large committee, great. And I'm not worried whether ward groups get, outnumbered in that, because that to me is a wholly and very different issue than dealing with the land use question in the long run. So I really don't want to be at all thinking in any kind of parochial terms about the health care issue.
That's a good point. Terry?
I agree with Mark, but I would think that the health care issue does have a greater impact on the less wealthy, the poorer people in the community. And as such, I want to make sure that we give special attention to our outreach to the low-income members of the community to make sure that they are adequately represented on this.
Okay. Go on.
Is there thinking about the timeline for this group?
Is there,
is this going to be like 2-year, 5-year?
You mean it's life?
Yeah.
Did you say it's life is the term?
It's life.
I don't. My recollection is that we haven't talked about it. Do you have a thought?
I do.
Well, it seems like the impact of this is going to be certainly shorter term than the land use issues. Maybe 2 years? Is that what we're talking about? The reason why I'm asking is because, one of my concerns with the other committee was how long people could stick it out over the process, and I didn't want it to be a situation where the people who had the resources and the capacity to come to a meeting every Wednesday night from 7 to 10 for 5 years would be the ones who got what they wanted out of the process. And I'm thinking that maybe that's going to be less of an issue with this process. And given that, I was thinking that maybe we might want to start with an idea of what would be a good working size for a committee like this, and think about maybe what were some of the breakout groups and some size for those breakout groups, and ask people to submit applications to be on the committee, and then do it relatively quickly. But then in that process of running through the applications, to look for a balance of interest between senior citizens and different stakeholder groups, as well as balance between the wards. And I don't know, would we want to consider anybody from outside of Tacoma Park at the same time, or some broader countywide organizations?
My opinion on the length of time that this committee might span, it should initially be set up to begin as soon as possible, and it might make sense, given the public health impact, to go the duration of the certificate of need process. I think that's kind of a clearly defined entity, and it would take place before the land use planning was really in full swing.
I don't know how long that is.
It can vary. They probably have more experience with that, but a year, 2 years.
Maybe you could help us get an answer to that question. Yes, have a seat, yes.
Sherry Stocks, resident of Washington
President of Washington Adventist Hospital. Welcome.
Thanks for letting me come by this evening. The one thing I'd like to suggest, even beyond the certificate of need process, that this committee stay in force, indefinitely. I think that could be very helpful, even after the certificate of need process is over and the process is complete. I would like to make a recommendation and suggest that the committee that's being formed is an ongoing group that continues to evaluate healthcare issues, beyond this particular process we're going through. Specifically to the certificate of need, this is not going to be a short process. I hate to speculate how long it could take, but I think more than a year is probably a pretty good estimate. And is it 2 years? I don't know, but this isn't going to happen in 6 months.
In terms of timing, could I just also ask the proposed facility in Long Branch, what's the timing on your proposal for that?
Sure. The Long Branch, we are hoping to break ground this summer on that project and be open before the end of 2007.
So it sounds like there's a year to 2 year sort of time frame on most of this. One of the things that, with respect to Colleen's point, that if we sort of put people on a committee with sort of indefinite or very long-term terms, that you tend to either wear people out or you get people who are simply able to be there for a long time. One of the things that we've done in terms of other committees in dealing with this is to appoint people for a certain term with the notion that we can reappoint them after that term. And sometimes people ask to be reappointed and sometimes they don't. It just provides them with a good time to just bow out. And they can do it gracefully simply by not requesting to be reappointed. I don't know how the council feels about an indefinite committee versus a committee with a specific term, but if we're thinking of making it a committee for some term, including indefinite longer than 2 years, one way to deal with the not wearing people out problem would be to appoint people for a certain period of time. And generally, when we've done this with other committees, a respectable percentage do ask to be reappointed, so you don't lose everyone in your institutional memory after a certain period of time, after the term, the 2 or 3 year term. Yeah.
Well, maybe we could start the committee just working on the issues related to the Washington Adventist Hospital and have, as a part of the closure of that committee, to recommend how a healthcare committee would go forward in the city and what its construction would be. Because I think for the most part, in the immediate future and going on, it sounds like for a year or two, this is going to be the principal issue that the committee is going to be dealing with. And they'll probably get a lot of experience about, what our needs are related to other healthcare issues, where we'll be at the end of the process. And at that time, we might want a healthcare committee that might look exactly like the one that we have, that we're about to develop, or one that looks entirely different and functions in a different way, and we can set it up at that time.
If I'm understanding where the council is right now, we are talking about appointing people, and we haven't sort of set a number yet, to this committee, that the appointments would not be tied to specific locations within the community, but that we would try and have representation from among different age groups, different income groups, and that we would be looking also for expertise in healthcare planning issues, and that we would appoint them for a specific period of time. Maybe 2 years might be something to start with, and then at the end of the 2 year period, we would reevaluate, see what we wanted to do at that point. We have in the past transformed short-term committees into long-term committees, as well as let them dissolve at that point if it appears that the issue is either turned into something else where we need different kinds of expertise or is resolved itself one way or the other. So if the council's comfortable with those things, maybe we could think about how large a committee we want.
Mayor, one more comment. You may
Yes.
want to consider some kind of a staggered term, beyond that first 2 years, for continuity purposes, if it's indeed determined that it would be beneficial to have it go on beyond the 2 year period, is to have some sort of staggered term. Because what would be a concern, I think, for everyone is that if everybody decided to resign, and, you know, for whatever reason, or decide they didn't want to renew, and then there was no continuity, got to start all over again with education and the process. So you may want to consider some sort of a staggered process.
I understand that concern. If we decided that the council would be reevaluating the committee in 2 years, then I don't know how we would stagger the term, because we would then have to sort of make assumptions about what in 2 years the council would decide to do. I guess I'm not that concerned about this issue, because generally what has happened in the past is when we've given people a 2-year term and allowed them to reapply after 2 years, a fair number of them have.
Okay.
And if we get people who are very interested in this issue, and we usually get people who are both very well qualified and very interested,
Right.
then I would expect and hope, based on our past experience, that a fair number of them would want to continue.
Good.
And at that point, if we wanted to turn this into a permanent committee, we could then figure out what was the appropriate term length and figure out at that point. So I think we can accommodate it within the kind of structure we're talking about.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Did somebody else have their hand up? Go ahead first.
If I can suggest in terms of numbers, I think a number that might make sense is somewhere in the 12 to 15 range. And I would also suggest that maybe the best way to approach the time frame is to suggest that this is a new committee, that the time frame that we anticipate is that it will probably take up to 2 years to work through the issues that we see at this point in time, and let everybody know that we will intend to reevaluate at the end of 2 years, with the possibility of making it a permanent committee with staggered terms if that seems appropriate at the time, so that as people sign up for it now, they have the same expectation that we do, that it could be up to 2 years.
They're committing for 2 years with the possibility of going longer than that.
If they so choose, if we so choose.
Right. If it still seems to be useful. Okay. So, what about the 12 to 15 number?
I agree.
I think so.
15 is probably the top end. Having been on the 21-member task committee.
You think 21 might not be optimal?
No, I'm not thinking that's optimal. But I think 15 would be good, and you speak 3 groups of 5 for breakout groups.
Okay.
Since I think I was guilty of helping appoint a 30-something member committee at some point for something, I have no problem with upper limits, but if 12 to 15, I wouldn't want to exclude people if we get some interested people and they get beyond 15. But I think operationally, 12 to 15 is reasonable.
Agree. Okay. Does that sound like a size that you could work with?
Makes sense.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if I'm understanding, we've got a committee appointed for a 2-year period, with the council looking at it again in 2 years and deciding whether to take it longer than that. But the people who we appointed would be asked to commit for a 2-year term. We would take applications from anyone who was interested. We would put out the notification, ask for applications for anyone who was interested. And when the council made the appointments, we would be conscious of making sure that we had representation from different age groups, different income levels, different parts of the city, different groups. And we would be looking for a number of 12 to 15, but for example, if we thought there were 16 excellent people, we wouldn't shut out the last person. Is that, am I correctly stating what you said?
Yeah, it just occurred to me, shouldn't we invite somebody from the neighborhood across Piney Branch, since they're going to be as affected by the removal as anybody else is? We have a precedent for involving, for example, in the first hospital committee, when we brought people in Andrew Strong, who then lived in the Silver Spring part of the area, wasn't technically in this, in the city, but it involved people who were going to be affected by what the hospital does. And I don't think the moving of the hospital or the changes in healthcare issues that only affect city residents, they affect non-city residents as well.
So is your suggestion that we essentially say there's one of those individuals?
I think we should reach out to somebody over there and invite them.
Okay.
My concern with that is the Washington Venice Hospital has a very large service area, and in fact, I think at a previous hearing, I think Dr. Stocks mentioned that a significant percentage of the patients at the hospital come from the District of Columbia.
Yeah, actually, and it's very nice to call me doctor, but I'm not a doctor, but that's okay. Actually, probably a fairly small percentage come to Tacoma Park. I think it's an interesting concept you bring up, and I actually think it's intriguing what Councilmember Eldridge is saying. You know, if you're going to do that strategy, you may want to consider people from Long Branch, Langley Park, you know, certainly into, you know, Hyattsville. So I'm not sure where you stop and start that discussion, but, you know, I'm certainly, I would be, for myself personally, would be open to having a representation, but I don't know if that's getting outside of what, you know, what your original concept was. It certainly makes sense, but I don't know if we can manage that.
So what I suggested earlier was that we invite organizations that are representative of the group, but what I'm hearing now is that we sort of open it up to individuals. Maybe we can get at the broader scope of the service delivery area through organizations that are countywide instead of more Tacoma specific. And that might be one way to bridge that.
Okay.
Right. One of the things that I wanted to raise earlier, I think I mentioned in a previous meeting, was the possibility of having some kind of ex officio members from a county health agency, from, you know, in both Montgomery County and Prince George's counties, may be able to provide some good expertise there, whether they're a member of the committee or they act in an ex officio role, that could assist with some of the broader issues that go outside of the city limits of Tacoma Park.
That sounds to me like a good idea. They could certainly, at the very, very least, provide some expertise that would be very helpful.
Yes, and Jerry, isn't it true that on your advisory board you have a number of notable individuals, some from the University of Maryland who are specialists in public health, and it may be that we could dip into that pool as well to cover some of the areas that we definitely need expertise in but may not find within our own city limits.
Yeah, Councilmember Berry, you're referring to the Center on Health Disparities that's being developed. There's 25 members on that. You're indeed correct. There are a lot of notable individuals on that would, I think that's a very interesting concept to somehow dovetail that into the process.
So it sounds like if we say that we're considering any number of ex officio members, that way they're not kind of taking a spot and up and in for 2 years, but available on a more ad hoc basis, that'll provide a lot of...
Right. Many of the committees that even I sit on that are outside of Tacoma Park are in my function kind of an ex officio role where I can bring data or information on processes to a committee, which then helps the committee figure out what kind of things they want to recommend. That may be something that would be useful.
Yeah, so I think if we kind of advertise or at least put out the word that any number of ex officio people would be helpful.
But I think we should go ahead and sort of think about some of the people that we definitely ought to have included, and I think the representatives of the county health departments of both Montgomery and Prince George's County ought to be people that we specifically solicit participation from. Are there other groups, Suzanne, that you think we should specifically solicit?
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, we can continue to think about that.
I just wanted to, in thinking about the staggered terms idea, when we have started other committees, haven't we had some people on for single year, other people on for 2 years, others on for 3 years? Would that make sense in this case to have people on for 1 year or 2 years?
When we've set up permanent committees with the notion that something would be an ongoing permanent committee, we have done that. If I'm understanding the council's thought at this point is that we wanted to let the committee go for 2 years and then make the decision as to whether it would be permanent or not. For example, when we did the Safe Roadways Committee, it was initially just a 1-year committee. Right. And then at the end of the committee's term, it came to us and recommended that there be an ongoing committee. And so if I'm understanding what the council is thinking, we would have a committee with an initial 2-year period, and then at the end of the 2 years, the council would decide whether to continue it. At that point, it would be, I think, very appropriate to think about staggering terms. But I think it would be important to make sure that the people who get appointed initially all agree to participate for the full 2-year term initially. And then we could, if we decided to make it permanent, we could continue to appoint some of those people for staggered terms going on into the future.
What I remember about the Safe Roadways Committee is that not too many people re-upped at the end of the 1-year period. So I would think that possibly having that 1-year mile marker would make sense, so that if someone's interest had dwindled, we could replace them with somebody who was willing to serve out the remaining 2-year term of the committee. The Safe Roadways Committee, the mission that we set up was a 1-year period.
And that's why I think maybe in this case, we're seeing that initial mission as 2 years, and so we need to let people know that that's the expectation. And I think we don't need to get into staggered terms unless and until we decide to make it more permanent and extend it.
Okay. It sounds to me like that we've sort of narrowed down some of the things that we want to do.
We can come back with some written structure for you guys to...
Yeah, I was thinking probably the next thing we should do is come back with like a resolution setting up a structure of the committee if we're comfortable with where we are now. I think we can also, if we want to talk a little bit about the structure of the second group, which is more the group that I was talking about when I said initially that I think we can come up with something that represents both the interests of the entire city and the interests of the particular neighborhoods.
Before we move on, can I ask for information on how and when this will be advertised, this healthcare committee? Do we have a chance to get it in the March newsletter?
I think the council should probably set it up formally before we do that.
If you'd like, I think Suzanne can draft a resolution, I think, kind of laying out some structure. I think the newsletter is getting ready to go out. I think today was technically the deadline. If nothing else, what we may want to do is at least take advantage of the March edition and put a brief blurb, if you will, basically informing the community that the council is in the process of forming the committee and providing a contact point, perhaps the city clerk's office, where someone can at least have a way of knowing the committee's being formed and can funnel their application or resume to Jesse.
That sounds like a good idea.
And could we set a deadline of sometime in March for receiving those applications and allowing the council to make a decision at that point?
Jesse, I think there's in the city code, isn't there a period of time that we have to advertise these things? Do you remember what it is? Is it 30 days?
I believe it's, for some reason, 30 days is what's kind of sticking in my mind. I think it's, you announce the openings on the committee, and I believe there's at least a 30-day period for residents to basically submit their names. We can verify that tomorrow, but that's my recollection.
If that's the case, then I think we should definitely get it into the March newsletter, even if we don't exactly know the details of the committee, because if we have a 30-day period, then we need to move it forward as quickly as we can. Is the council comfortable with that, where we are? Yes. Okay. In terms of the second one, there's a slightly longer time frame with this because we wanted to get the first one into place as soon as we could. The discussion was that we also needed to look at the potential redevelopment of that location, assuming that the hospital was, as it intends to, moving. And we had talked about the entire city having an interest, but also the neighborhoods having an interest. And if we had a person from each ward plus someone representing each of the surrounding neighborhoods, I think we could balance those two interests. I think the surrounding neighborhoods are between the creeks and Ranch Sligo. What's yours next to it? SS Carroll. Do you have one that's right next to it, Terry?
Yes, it's again the Franklin Apartments.
The Franklin?
Tower.
But that we're talking about adjacent. I mean, I think if you wanted to appoint your Ward 1 person from the towers, that would be appropriate. But
Franklin is not adjacent.
right, it's not adjacent.
Franklin's not adjacent.
Franklin's not adjacent.
Terry wants to conservation of Franklin Ward 4. That makes sense.
Okay.
We're not talking about a healthcare issue here, and so I don't see why.
Oh, wait.
Ward 4 is adjacent.
The second committee. We're talking about the second committee here.
We're talking about not the.
I think we've wrapped up the healthcare committee. Now we're talking about the redevelopment.
So you're saying that the residence property has to abut the hospital property?
We're talking about neighborhood associations or neighborhoods.
The proposal that I put on the table was that we have a person on this committee from each of the wards to make sure that the citywide interests are represented. And the other is that we have a representative of each of the immediately adjoining neighborhoods also on the committee to look at the interests of the immediately adjoining
Ritchie
neighborhoods.
Citizens Association, which encompasses all of Maple Avenue and Ritchie Avenue, Oswego Avenue in Geneva within Ward 4.
Okay. So that would give us, that gives us 10 people in the committee. Is the council comfortable with that?
Are you thinking about historic Tacoma?
Well,
Historic Tacoma, the historic district goes all the way down to the hospital on Carroll Avenue. Well,
I mean, what does the council think?
I support historic Tacoma being on the committee. I think they were on the one that you all convened before.
Why don't we give direction to the staff to include each of the wards, each of the adjoining neighborhoods, then put historic Tacoma as a question mark, and we'll deal with that. And I don't think we need to spend the time right now to sort of decide whether they're in and out. Maybe the council can think about it. We'll come back to that one issue, because I think we're fairly close to sort of coming to closure.
Mayor?
Yeah.
What about the CUC? Is there any validity to having them on there?
That's a very good point. If we're talking about immediately adjoining areas, that would, including CUC in the committee, would be a good idea too.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think right away of Columbia Union College as an entity that is, a member of the city that has a great interest in that
Yes.
property.
Right, that's what we just said. I'm seeing people saying yes to CUC.
Okay. I'm sorry, I saw that with a no. Well, I won another argument.
No, I'm just saying, is the council comfortable with where we are, leaving the issue of, I'm seeing, in terms of historic Tacoma, I'm seeing sort of some questions and some not sure yet. And so I think if that's the only issue that's still open.
Would CUC?
No, I'm talking about historic Tacoma.
Right. And did CUC get the thumbs up?
Well,
Yes.
as I'm looking around, I'm seeing
Okay.
people nodding on CUC.
Okay, well, I'm thumbs up on historic Tacoma.
Okay,
so
I
that's
understand that, and I'm not seeing anybody saying, well, I won't say that. I'm seeing doubtful on historic Tacoma and a lot of question on historic Tacoma. And I think we can resolve this at another time, because I think we're very close to coming up with something, and if we bring it before the council again, I think we can probably resolve that.
This is an urgent.
Well, I think we should try and move it through. You're right, it's not as urgent as the other one. Okay, is the council comfortable with where we are at this point? And we'll be certainly coming forward with the first one within a very short period of time, and then we'll come forward with the second one as soon as we can resolve the issue by the historic.
On this, you're not looking for a resolution immediately on the second one?
No, the first one certainly has a more timeliness
I
issue
understand.
to it.
I was just checking here. Okay.
And also, actually, I think it will probably be easier to appoint, however, because if what we need to do is have one person from each ward, generally what we do is we ask the council member for that ward to make a suggestion after consulting, obviously, with the people from their ward. And we could talk about how we do the neighborhood associations, but one assumes that either we would ask the council member to consult with the neighborhood association, or that we would ask them to come to the council directly. We can do one of each way. And assuming with CUC, we can simply ask them to select someone to be appointed to the committee, and if we decide to go with Historic Tacoma, we can do the same thing. I think all of those institutions are accustomed to participating in these kinds of organizations. So I think we're fairly close to conclusion on both of those.
I have a question.
Yes.
In other committees that you've done like this, you've had people from each ward appoint somebody, and then you've also had, sometimes the mayor has some appointments, but you didn't mention that this time.
That's right, I didn't. I don't, what does the council think?
I think it's always been a bad idea.
Thank you for your vote of confidence, Terry. You know, I don't know that it's necessary in this point. I think there's a geographic spread issue, and then I also think there's a neighborhood participation issue and adjoining organizational participation issue, and I think those are the most important things. So I would be happy to leave it with that as long as... I'll go ahead and appoint historic committee. Solve that one. How about that? All right. Okay. All right. Good. So I think we are there. Thank you all. We appreciate your counsel, and we also appreciate your participation.
Thank you.
So I think we're ready to go forward, at least with the first one. We'll do a resolution, and then we'll ask for applications. We'll interview the applicants, and then we'll put together a committee. You're welcome to come to any of those discussions if you'd like.
Okay, thank you.
And then we'll also move forward with the second one, although probably not as fast a track as the first one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We also appreciate you breaking away from whatever else it was you were doing this evening.
Just family stuff.
Just your poor family who probably never sees you, right?
That's all right. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. The final item on our agenda this evening is discussion of legislative priorities, and I assume, Suzanne, you're also going to update us on where a number of things are.
Yes, let me pass out some papers here. I apologize for not getting the information that I'm passing out now to you earlier. In one sense, it's because the legislative items have been so busy lately that actually trying to compile what I've been doing with it has been a little tough. What I have listed here are some of the bills that I've been discussing with you and with members of our delegation in a number of different ways. And I wanted to give you an update about some of these items and then ask your advice on some of the things and get some direction as we go forward. Generally, in a legislative session, there have only been a handful of items that have caused a great deal of attention that I've worked with you on. This year's been much more lively, and I'm not particularly sure why. I know it even caught some of the folks off guard that work in Annapolis routinely. But I wanted to go through these items and bring you up to date. The first thing was early on in the session, a veto override of the speed monitoring system, the speed camera bill, which the Montgomery County had proposed for Montgomery County. The General Assembly had passed, the governor had overridden, and then it had vetoed, and then the legislature overrode it on January 26th of this year, and it will now be going into force. I wanted to identify that a whole slew of bond bills are going in.
Do you want us to discuss each one of those individually or discuss them all at the end?
Well, I think maybe discuss them in groups. Was there something in particular you wanted to mention about the veto or the speed camera bill?
More sort of in terms of follow-up. My understanding is that Montgomery County is now taking a look at where they would install these speed cameras. And I know that there's also, there's an issue about, what Tacoma Park should do in terms of
right, and I don't have that answer. I know there's been some investigation from some of our staff, but I don't have the updated information on what the next steps are from Tacoma Park's point of view. There are a couple aspects of the law that affect Montgomery County specifically as the county that they have some promises to us that they will work with us on to ensure that municipalities, for example, are dealt with fairly in this process. And I have every intention, I have every expectation that will follow through.
The other thing that I've heard is that the Montgomery County wants to be very careful about how they implement this because they understand that the rest of the state is going to be sort of watching how it gets implemented and what its impact is. And so I know which I very much agree with. But I think that we need to make sure that we are very much up on what they're thinking and what they're doing, so that, first of all, we don't end up doing something that is counter to what they're doing, or they don't end up doing something that would make it difficult for us either way, but also so that we make sure that the work that we're doing has a positive influence on the future prospects of speed cameras. Bruce?
And if I can just add one thing that I don't necessarily need an answer tonight, but I think ties in with this. Over a number of years, there's been an effort to have all of the remaining lights turned over from the state to the
highways to the county.
We haven't heard that it's happened yet, and I would hate to get to the point where the speed monitoring system goes for implementation and they look at locations and they say, whoops, at least in the case of any traffic lights in the city of Tacoma Park, none of yours qualify because they're not under our jurisdiction. They're still with the state, and I'd hate to go there. So anything we can do to check on that and make sure that we don't end up there would be good.
Yes, we will.
I have a comment on the speed camera legislation as well. I think it opens up a lot of new opportunities for the city to engage private companies who are willing to do this in a cost-sharing way. I think that the fact that the county's jurisdiction doesn't extend to our streets makes it difficult for us ever to take care of the light at intersection problem. The conversations I've had have made it seem like that's part of the problem. We have state highways and we have city streets, and the county really it would be a stretch for them to get involved. With the speed cameras, the companies that have looked at putting red light cameras in Tacoma Park, where that might not be have a fiscal return that they were comfortable with, I believe with speed cameras, the situation is different. And that as long as there was cost sharing, the city could probably engage a private company and not really have that enormous investment that the red light cameras entailed. So I'd like to see us move forward with that as quickly as possible. And I think we have other municipalities to consult, namely Rockville, who are doing that as well. So I hope we'll put out a request for proposals and as soon as we can.
Well, that's why I think we need to coordinate with the county. The county has started to think about some of these issues and think about some of the things that should be considered before you move forward with this. And I think we need to work with them on these things so that we don't sort of end up rushing ahead into something and later going, oops.
I think on this issue, it's one that the city and other cities have explored fairly well. Rockville, the city of Rockville is not looking to the county to put speed cameras in their city. I don't think we should be either.
No, that wasn't what I meant. I meant that the county is looking at issues having to do with speed cameras, and I know Rockville is also. And my understanding is that Rockville is working with the county, and I think we should also, in terms of thinking about the issues that need to be considered when you're considering doing this. Not that whether you just, it's not a question of whether you do it or don't do it. I'm assuming we will, if we can afford it. But it's a question of what you think about when you do it. For example, there's the issue of fixed cameras versus mobile cameras. And there's the issue of, how you set them up and what rules that you have for placement and that kind of thing. It's not just a question of let's go or not go. I think there's issues to be decided prior to moving forward.
On this, I just wanted to indicate that the follow-up on many of these items is not something that I have worked on. I've worked for lobbying for these items and have been working with the intergovernmental staff of Montgomery County to have a coordinated impact on the legislature so that these things would pass. And obviously, there's quite a lot of follow-up that needs to be done on it.
Yeah, and maybe, and I should sort of say, probably our comments are more directed to the city manager.
I think she heard it.
Okay.
The next category that I have on this list has to do with bond bills. Bond bills are state grants that legislators request, and there's dozens and dozens of them that are requested every year by every legislator, and this year's is no exception. We have a bond bill that has been submitted on our behalf for the Tacoma Park Community Learning Center focused on gym funding. And generally, we have our District 20 delegation putting this item in. I was interested to see that Montgomery Chair Barkley and Delegate Natalino also co-sponsored the bill this time, and that's very useful. We will not know how much we'll get, how it works, until later on in the process, but we will have to go and testify on its behalf and that kind of thing. I also noticed as I was scanning through some of the lists that the Casa Multicultural Center is one of the bond bills that has been submitted, and I was pleased to see kind of both the Montgomery County, Prince George's County joint sponsorship of that. That is something that I think will assist us in our long-range vision of service along the border.
Has there also been a bond bill introduced for Historic Tacoma?
There may be. I didn't see it, but I only looked at some, and like I said, there's a very long list.
I believe there has been.
I will double check if that's
something. Historic Tacoma is interested in purchasing a property to create a location for them and for make their records accessible to the public. And I don't know what the.
I'll share with you a list of the bond bills from this area.
That would be helpful.
There's a long list.
Thank you.
Can I ask my colleagues on the bond bill question? I don't know if I'm the only one on this, so please feel free to weigh in. I'm really uncomfortable with the council not taking additional public comment before we forge ahead with the gym. I think that the conversation we had with the public was that Phase 1 and Phase 2 were approved and paid for, and that we would have a conversation or a dialogue with the public before gym funding was sought. This looks to me like gym funding is being sought, and I don't want to I just want to make sure that we are including the public in this process. I know certainly we have a limited window with the state legislative session ending in April, but I'm not sure I understand why we couldn't publicize a public hearing that would happen in March and take that public comment and then proceed if we have the consensus possibly of the community that it's important to move forward on this. I think that's what we've heard for the most part in every other public forum that we've had. I'm not sure why we're not following through on that commitment that we did make in the last conversation about this.
The last conversation I remember having, we said that we would postpone consideration of the gym until we had additional information on the cost of the gym and whether there were things that we could do to make it more cost effective. We've begun that process. The city manager has just told us today that we are shortly going to get some information back on the utility location. We're beginning the borings. Until we have those pieces of information, actually even when we do, I don't know what we can tell the public about the cost of the gym and how we would pay for it. And I hate to put people in the position where we're asking them, you know, we don't have anything more to tell you, but how do you feel about it now? I mean, I think we should have a lot of opportunities for public comment, but I would like to give the public the information they asked for the last time, which was how much would it cost and where would we get the money before we ask for them to tell us what they think about it.
The conversation that we had the last time was about how much more money the city should borrow. What I remember taking place with the community center is something I don't think we should repeat here. We were awarded money, and then we decided to engage the community in a discussion about having a facility. With the gym, I feel that we have gotten direction from the public very clearly that they would like to have the discussion first, the commitment from the community, and then lining up the money. And at the point where the city is looking at borrowing the additional amount to complete the site and complete the facility, then it certainly is important for us to have very hard numbers that we can say we feel fairly certain that this is the amount the city would need to borrow to add to what the state and other entities have given us in order to complete the gym. That makes sense to me. But I believe that where we left the conversation was we will consult the community before we proceed to phase 3.
Actually, in terms of the first part of the community center, there was a multiple-year discussion about what the community wanted to do with the community center, including, I remember, 4 committees within the community before we proceeded with any part of the community center. And so I think the public was very much involved in that discussion.
Money before or after that?
The money came in over a period of 4 years, and so we began the discussion at the same time that Peter Francho introduced the first bill.
Okay, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that we are again doing that, where we're beginning the discussion as a bill is introduced, and I remember us committing to the public that we would not be committing the city to it until the public discussion took place. I'm very comfortable.
I don't remember that. I don't remember that.
I believe that the public asked us to involve them in the process from the start, instead of waiting until we had some money and then we had political pressure to spend it, and doing that as swiftly as possible.
What does the rest of the council want to do? Colleen?
I have a comment and a question. Let me ask the question first. If we get the bond funding, we don't have to accept it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. But even given that, I agree with what Joy is saying, and it's exactly the feedback that I have heard in the community as well, is that people want to have a discussion of a gym, what it would look like, and there is certainly an impression in the community that the opportunity for funding drove the development of the community center instead of it being a community-driven process. So I think there's a lot of value to involving the community at this point. I had a lot of varied experiences going and knocking on people's doors. I had people who didn't want to build a gym and people who wanted to build a gym. But even within that, there was a lot of variation. Folks who were interested in a gym that was really just about the kids. They didn't mind having a smaller gym with smaller courts. And then I went to several houses when I said, well, you know, some people have said this. And there was no interest in a gym that didn't have full professional-size NBA basketball courts in it. So I think there's a lot of variation in when you say a gym, what that means to people. And at the very least, you know, I think we could have that part of the conversation so that we know before we go out and we get cost estimates, what kind of a gym are we talking about doing cost estimates on. So I agree with a lot of what Joy is saying.
I'm assuming that we will get cost estimates on more than one thing. Otherwise, how do we know what it's going to be? Mark?
Yeah, I think we ought to, you know, start a process of having discussions about what a gym ought to look like and what should be involved in it. But I think it's kind of rewriting history to act like there was no gym discussion. The gym was the thing, more than all the other stuff we did, that I sense people wanted when this whole project began. It's the thing that got left out because we thought we had another source of money for it, not because it was the not because it was the part that was least popular. It was something we thought we'd fund with something other than the money we had available. I don't want to revisit those decisions because it's sort of irrelevant at this point, but I think the gym itself was probably the most widely supported element of this project. I have no problem in going ahead and getting the money. If the council gets the money, and we've got money from the hospital, and if we don't, maybe the $1.7 million pays for everything and we're not borrowing anything. It may be that we need more money, and nobody knows the answer to that question until you decide what kind of gym you're going to build. And I think that we ought to go forward, have the discussion with the community, decide what it is we want to look at and get a price on it, and then see where we stand at that point. I don't have any problem starting that process now, but if we don't stay with the bond process now, then we're waiting another year out before we see the money. And I think that would be a mistake. It'll just make the gym more expensive.
I agree with Mark. What I've heard over and over again through this whole process is the gym is very important to people. I'm committed to doing a gym, and I think it's a question of the design, the extent that we can fit it on the site, and where the money comes from to pay for it. And I think, from my point of view, gathering the various sources of money together as we go forward in that process and get appropriate feedback at various times as we need it on the phases of it with the information that we're gathering is the appropriate way to go. There was something else that you said about
This is the best year to get bond money.
No, but it was, I'll come up with it. But there was another reason. You gave one reason to do something that were two very important ones.
Thank you, Mayor Porter. I'm not sure what the question is on the table, but I think certainly I support the idea of planning before you start committing money to be spent. And I think a big part of the planning process within the city of Tacoma Park is to engage the city residents to find out what they want and what form anything should take. It certainly is true with the gymnasium if we decide to build one. I think what I have heard as I talk with city residents is important to me, and that is that we use a much more organized approach to the gymnasium and a more inclusive approach to the gymnasium planning than what was done in the for the community center. And I don't personally find fault with what happened in the past, but I think that there's at least a perception among the community that we could do a better job this time with the gymnasium. And so I see no harm at all in forming a committee of residents to help with that process in the near term, rather than waiting until we get or don't get any specific money at any point in time. So I think
I very much agree with the point that you made, that the critical piece in which to engage the community is the planning of this process. I guess the first issue is that we are talking at this point about the bond bill. If there is a council member who feels we should not support the bond bill at this point, please say so at this point, and if need be, we will take a vote on whether we support the bond bill. But if there is a sense that we should go forward with the bond bill, then that's the subject of this particular discussion. I would agree with Terry. I think we need to have a community-involved planning process, and we've begun to get the first pieces of information from that, and I certainly think we should continue to keep the community involved. I would remind the council that we actually have appointed a committee which is supposed to involve the community in the planning process, and that is the liaison committee. And, you know, getting as many people involved in that discussion as possible would be good. You know, having discussions in front of that committee, in front of the council, as soon as we get information on the gym site plan and the initial, what that means for the initial designs, I think is an excellent idea. I think we should do that. And then helping get the community's input into helping us think about, you know, given the strictures of the site, what does this mean for the design, what kinds of things should we cost out, and then getting the community's input on that, I think would be quite appropriate, and I would hope we can move forward on that. But at this point, this evening, unless the council feels that there's an issue about whether or not we should support this bond bill, I suggest that we move forward at this point on this issue, and I would be happy to continue to talk to council members about the process that we set up for involving the community in the planning of the gymnasium and the decisions about whether we move forward at each stage of the process. So, is there anyone who thinks we should not support the bond bill? Joy?
I respectfully request that the mayor put on the agenda a public forum on this issue in March, so that in our next newsletter, it can be publicized, the date of that public forum, and the community can have a voice in us getting this bond funding. I think there's nothing greater that could get us that money in Annapolis than showing the community support for this. And I am loath to think that we are about to do the same thing that we did the first time around again.
Can we decide on the $1 million? Can we decide on the $1 million?
Yeah. What do you decide on it?
Just, is there support to move forward?
Okay.
Support for this?
Yes, I'm seeing, is there, other than Joy, is there anyone who does not wish to move forward at this point with the $1 million?
I'm sorry, Mayor Porter, I would appreciate if you would not mischaracterize my position. I am very much in favor of the bond funding of the gym, and I would simply like us to have the integrity of following through on our commitment to the public, and I believe that would be in the form of a public hearing on this issue before the end of April.
You want a public forum on whether we should support the bond funding? Is that what you want the public forum on?
No, actually, I want the public hearing on whether the community would like us to go forward with a gym.
But they're not going to know how much a gym costs or what it looks like or how big it's going to be or anything. And they've already said they want us to go forward with the gym. The question that came up the last time was, how much is this going to cost? What is it going to have in it? And we don't know the answers to any of those questions. And presumably, their opinion is going to be affected by those pieces of information.
Well, as I said when I started my comments, I may be the only one who feels this way, but I was uncomfortable with the way we were proceeding with funding coming before a commitment by the public. If no one else on the council has a problem with that lack of communication with the public, then I am the only one, and I stand corrected. I am in favor of the gym and the bond funding.
Okay, I would disagree with your characterization of that also, but let's just leave that, unless there is somebody who objects to us supporting this bond bill. Colleen?
No, I don't object to supporting the bond bill after I asked the question and you answered it. I just want to say that there has been a lot of buzz on the listservs, and I've gotten personal emails and a couple of phone calls about this. So you know, there is some concern in the community, and since it's related to actually the submission of the request for the bond bill, I don't think it's totally inappropriate that we mention it at this time when we're talking about supporting the bond bill. I support the bond bill. I think everybody on the council does, but I think it's important to bring it up that there's interest in the community about talking about it, and it's kind of that sense of the cart before the horse, and whether or not it's real or not, there's a significant amount of buzz and conversation about it, and I don't think it's inappropriate to address it or respond to it.
Okay. As I said, my plan was, as soon as we get information that we can present to the public, information in terms of the limitations of the site where we were planning to put the gym, information on what different kinds of gyms would cost us. As soon as we have that information, I think we should put that before the public and talk to them about this. At this point, we have no information beyond the last conversation that we had, and other than simply saying to them, well, this is what you told us before. You said to us, we don't come back to us until you have additional information, and we don't have additional information. We just want to see if you have anything more to say at this point. I would feel that we had not fulfilled the promise we made to the public if we went back to them without that information. I think that they said to us, we want this information, and if we went back to them and said, well, we don't have it yet, but what do you think? I think we should come to them with the information. And, you know, the city manager is proceeding forward on the studies of the site. We could decide to move forward, for example, with getting the expertise, the engineering architecture expertise to cost out some things with the gym, and I hope we can move forward to do that. But right now, I think the issue before us is the bond bill, and I'd like to go ahead and move forward with the legislative report. I will put back on the council's agenda a further discussion of the process by which we discuss what the next steps are and where we get the information. Barb, did you have something you want to add?
And certainly this is probably an item that requires further discussion by the council. Obviously, one of the steps that we had talked about at the priority session on the 30th was talking about a next step being a conceptual design and feasibility study. In thinking about that a little bit more since the 30th, one of the things that we may need to do in order to really come up with good data is to have some community discussion about what are must-haves in a gym, what are wants. And part of the reason I say that is when you bring someone in to do a conceptual design and cost estimates, you can't have an architect bouncing back and forth and not having a real focus on what it is that the community is trying to get to and what are its goals. Obviously, one of the things that you need a professional to do is examine different parking alternatives, and I would leave that to whomever the city hires to work with us. But there is going to be a point in time, and I guess in my mind that would probably take place before that conceptual design is done, where the community, however that happens, whether that's through the Community Center Liaison Committee or some other structure that the council deems appropriate, is going to have to define for the architectural firm if a gym has to have bleachers, for instance. Is that a must-have or is that a want? And I do think there has to be a community discussion about those issues. We have to define those parameters, and we have to provide those to an architect so they at least have some base design concepts that they are working with. So I know that there had been some questions that I had received in terms of what the staff had laid out on the 30th. The public process wasn't specifically mentioned. As I had mentioned at that time, it's because the whole issue of the gym, quite frankly, at this point is somewhat speculative. We don't know where we're going. But I would say that that public process has to take place in some way, shape, or form sooner rather than later. Obviously, what we're asking the community to do, at least in the scenario I'm suggesting, is to kind of define those must-haves and those wants, wish list kind of items, give those to an architect. They can basically develop some cost estimates based on those parameters, and then truthfully, I think we'll have to go back out to the community again. Because what someone thinks as a must-have may change somewhat when they see a price tag on it. But I do think we can't move forward with basically an entire wish list approach as being a must-have. There has to be some sense of priority from the community as we move forward and develop some alternatives.
I would agree with that. That sort of is the notion that I had assumed we were operating under. I guess the only change I would make to that is I think that in addition to having community discussions, there needs to be discussions in front of the council at the points at which we need to make decisions. So I would agree with that. Can we come to a conclusion on this discussion? Terry, last.
Yes, as long as I get the last word.
I'm sorry. All right, Bruce, go ahead. And don't.
He wants the last word, so do I get to go first?
I will remind you that it is 10:25.
All right. I appreciate all that Ms. Matthews has said, and I think that she's covered most of what I wanted to say of the things that we needed, and I'm glad to hear that she's advocating for that also. You know, looking at going out and asking for money for something that we don't even know what it is smacks a little bit of having the cart before the horse. But given the way things work, I certainly support that. I'm a little puzzled, though, when I see that what we're asking for $1 million for is a community learning center, when I thought we were sitting here talking about a gymnasium.
Yeah, I can address that in just a moment.
I appreciate that, because I wouldn't want to mislead our state delegates on what it is that we're going to be building when we get to $1 million.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, let me just say a couple words. The Tacoma Park Community Learning Center is the title that was given in 1998 when the first funds were requested. And so that has continued throughout this is the 9th year that bond bill funds have been requested for this community center, and they've kept that title. So it encompasses the computer center and all of the other components that make this complex. We have to prepare each year a bond bill fact sheet that gives very clear information about the specifics of the request, how many people would likely be using it, a whole series of things. It's very clear in that bond bill fact sheet that this is Phase 3 of the Tacoma Park Community Learning Center, which is a gym and associated parking facilities, if needed. And so it's very clear in the materials that the legislators will receive that that's what the point is. One of the things that I've found interesting this year is that in putting in the request for the bond bill, people have seen the facility, they're hearing about it, they hear people talking about the need for a gym, and so there's a little bit more buzz about it in the legislature than there has been in the past. And I think that that's part of the reason that this is going forward as it is and requesting for $1 million, which is a substantial amount of money. I don't think we would get the full $1 million. We certainly will push for it. But, it does show kind of the legislators' excitement about this project, that this is being put forward in this manner.
I'm just puzzled how you can provide clarity on what's going to be done with the money when we haven't had that first public hearing to even talk about, does it include weight room, does it include parking, what does it include?
Well, if you haven't gotten a copy of the fact sheet, and you may not have because it just went in, I'll make sure that all the council members have it, and it is always included in the public information that we provide on this. The other aspect I just wanted to talk about very briefly was the timing on this, which is that the state session is very short, and so all of a sudden I receive a call saying, gee, somebody submitted a bill on your behalf, a bond bill on your behalf. We'll send you the electronic fact sheet form. Please fill it out immediately and send it right back. And then it gets scheduled for hearings, and those hearings happen in early March. But we don't know until a short time before the hearings happen. And you've been at them before, so you know how that works. It's a little bit of a cow call. And then we go and we do a hearing before the House, and we do a hearing before the Senate, and then you don't hear anything for several weeks, and then you find out if you got something or not. It's a kind of a rapid process. So I just wanted to kind of lay out how this works, and then we find out what that means. I also want to distinguish one thing. As we're going forward and talking about the preparatory work towards making a decision on the gymnasium, when the original funds were allocated through a bond bill request, but it was actually funds from Governor Glendening at the time. When those funds came, we used some of those funds. Our expectation was to use some of those funds for the studies, for the conceptual designs and the analysis of the different sites that people were being considered for the gym and for the whole facility. And for that reason, we had committed some of those funds that we got from the state for that work. It may be important as you go through this step to not commit, if we get some of these funds, to not commit these funds until you make a decision on the gym. And then you have that, you have a little less difficulty with what has been a criticism of the project, which is, kind of getting the funds before and using the funds before some decisions have been made. So I'm just kind of saying we are in a little bit better situation than we were at the early stages of this project to be able to make a decision before committing these state funds.
I just have to clarify again. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many of the people sitting here actually went through that whole process. I don't think too many of us did. But there was a multi-stage process. The first year was just a question of, did we want a facility like this? And there was committees and all this sort of thing about whether we wanted and we had a survey in the city newsletter, and we had focus groups, and we had all this sort of thing. First question. Then once people said, yes, they did want a facility, then we appointed 3 committees. one on site where it would be, one on what it would contain, and one on whether there were other alternatives other than our building our own facility. And those committees, all three of them, and this was after we had already decided to go forward with it, then those three committees met for a very long period of time. And there were three options for a site proposed. One was in this area. It was a city park, I remember, was included. Something else was included. That went up for public discussion, and we had public hearings on that. And then there was a presentation by the chair of the program committee on what should be included in the facility, which was much more than we could ever have afforded to include. And there were priority items and non-priority items, as the report by the third committee. And then there were further after that, there were ongoing discussions once this site was decided on as the site where we would build it. There were discussions as to what it would look like and what it would include and where we would get the money for it and how much it would cost. So
Yes,
there wasn't money that I'm aware of, at least. There wasn't any money committed prior to the community's decision that we would move forward with the process. Suzanne's correct that there was some money committed to site planning, but only after we had decided to go forward with some facility at some site. And at that point, there was discussion of sites all over the city and what it would look like and how big it would be and whether we were going to tear down the library and all those other issues that came up. So just to clarify, you know, go back and look at the newsletter articles that were written and the Voice articles that were written at the time. There was a long, year-long process, very beginning of the process. Should we go forward with this or not? And the decision was yes. Bruce.
And I'll try and make my points real quickly, because we got more to do and we need to get on with it. But I just wanted to point out that people should remember that as far as the gym, that there has been paper put to pencil, and that as part of the whole plan, it's not what we think we're going to go forward with, but there is a plan laid out for the gym and everything that goes in it. So it's not like we're talking about, you know, some obscure concept. Also, I remembered my point that I think Mark missed when talking about the reason we didn't go forward with the gym at the time was that we thought there was another source of money. It was also that but it was also because the way the project worked with the various phases that would have to happen around here, the logical phasing led to the gym being the last piece because of access to the site. So that it wasn't just that it was put off for money reasons, it was put off for the only way the project would work. And the final point that I just wanted to make was that I think all of us are trying to get input from residents as we go through this. We have continued to do that, and we're all looking for a good process and a good result, and I don't think we need to characterize various people's efforts as having more or less integrity or anything like that. I think we all just need to move forward.
And the final point is this whole project has been the subject of a great deal of historical revisionism. Let me try mine. As I recall, the project did not suffer from a lack of public input. In fact, there was a tremendous amount of public input.
There was an enormous amount.
So much public input, in fact, that the public input amounted to a project that was unbuildable for the amount of money that was on the table. So we had to scale back in a process called value engineering. And in the end, people did not get what they had hoped for, but they did get what was available for the money available. Now, what I don't want to do is support a project that is going to be built one floorboard at a time, where we're out in a beggar-thy-neighbor posture, getting money from here or there over the period of 5 years and destroying whatever credibility we have left. So what I think is the key issue here is that we have to be prepared to walk away from whatever it is that we would like to see if there is no money available. We will not be cajoled, snookered, or pushed into an agreement that is a bad one and is irresponsible. So, yes, by all means, no one is against full public involvement and input. We have a lot of ideas for a process that can be used. Nobody is against a very accurate means of pricing whatever it is we end up deciding we want. No one is against those things, but we've got to be prepared to say we're not going forward with it when the time comes to make the decision. We didn't do that last time. We should do it this time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to everyone for your comments, and I'm taking from this that we do want to move forward on the bond bill. All right.
Thank you.
Fiscal impact
This
statement.
was supposed to be a short item before I get to the ones that were more important, more, required a little bit more explanation, but I'll try to be succinct. One of the things that I do in my job is I receive requests for fiscal impact statements, and so as different bills are proposed, if it seems as if they may have an impact fiscally on municipalities, I am the Tacoma Park contact for the State Legislative Services Office, and they forward me an email. I get at least one a day to respond if there would be an impact on the city of Tacoma Park. Generally, I do these and respond right away without sharing that information with folks other than Barbara. So if there's something that seemed like it was of particular interest, I try to share it with the full council. But it's a real quick turnaround kind of thing. One of the things, there were two bills recently that I responded to that I think are particularly of interest. One didn't have a fiscal impact, but I kind of perk up at questions about open meetings acts and the executive function. Basically, this is a bill for a reporting requirement very similar to something we already do, so I don't think it doesn't seem to be a change. I did check with Jesse and with the city attorney to ensure that it was not would not have a negative impact on it.
So this basically requires entities such as us to report on executive functions also?
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify that that's what it was, which we already do. Yes.
The second item, this is Senate Bill 488 on an eminent domain request. There's at least 3 or 4 bills being proposed in the state legislature that are kind of in reaction to the Supreme Court's ruling related to eminent domain, and especially the taking of property by a government with the goal of eventually having more money for the jurisdiction. That somehow there would be an economic development project, for example, that would improve the economic health of the community. And the concern about taking private property basically for money, as opposed to for some other kind of public good that people tend to think about, a road, a park, some other kind of a utility facility for the municipality. I must say that I'm very nervous about these particular bills, and I have responded on the fiscal impact statement regarding what I would think would have the fiscal, some fiscal impacts to the city of Tacoma Park. And I have attached in the handout the copy of this one bill and my response to the Legislative Services Office. One of the things that I find that these bills can do is really take away the attraction of having a public-private partnership. And I could see a situation, and I can imagine one, for example, on New Hampshire Avenue in a couple places where we have all these little parcels. One of the most useful things that government can bring to a development is land acquisition and consolidation. Have the government involved in that, and then identifying some of the areas are more appropriate for private use. For example, you've got a piece of property, you might want to park in one section of it, and another part is in between, in the middle of a commercial strip along a major road. You would think that the part along the commercial strip would be more appropriate to be sold to a private entity for part of that commercial base. So that may be a decision that has been discussed through a master planning type process, and it's a decision that goes through the very difficult eminent domain discussion that happens before it gets approved. It could have a substantial financial impact on the community if we didn't have that authority. And so I did submit that as part of the fiscal statement. I would like you to know that there are all these bills out there, and some of the bills were actually being discussed as part of the reason that they didn't want to go forward with the condominium conversion bill. that there would be some kind of a conflict. So I'm just letting you know it's a big issue in Annapolis. We may end up wanting to take a position on it, something greater than the fiscal statement that I have submitted. Another thing that I submitted and copied you on was a bill that would allow municipalities to have a little bit more control over building, massing of residential properties, setbacks, and tree and water effects. So basically, this is a bill that's being proposed, especially by the Chevy Chase area, as a protection against mansionization. And the city of Tacoma Park, went through and submitted a letter supporting the bill on the behalf of the other municipalities in Montgomery County that were promoting that. And I think you've been copied on a number of emails from other municipalities as well, urging our support. I understand, I think there may be a newspaper article coming out on that soon as well. There are issues out there trying to deal with property taxes. I'm sorry, did you want to?
I was just going to say, do we have a city policy established by resolution on this, or is it sort of informal?
On the building one?
On the mansionization issue?
There's not really. I took it upon myself, given the statements that people have said about that the council has usually taken its position about wanting to have more control, especially over issues such as stormwater effects.
We have taken that position, and I'm not arguing. I think you made a reasonable extension of that. Should we clarify this, perhaps?
It may very well be a good idea. These are one of these awkward things during legislative sessions when things go so quickly that I had to kind of talk with a variety of people and make a judgment call on that.
There are a couple of issues actually coming up. I believe there's also streetlights issue that the council has not taken a formal position on that. Maybe we might want to do that before too long.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I mentioned that there's some bills being proposed to increase the homeowner's property tax credit and make it so it's a little easier to take advantage of that. That's something that the council has supported in the past. I've not sent in any position statement on it, but I would assume that that's something that I would do.
When we were having a discussion with Speaker Bush at the Mayor's Association meeting, he mentioned that there were several bills either submitted or about to be submitted on this issue, and suggested to all of the mayors that this might be something they were interested in. I would very much like to see, in your spare time, if we could assemble what all of these are, and maybe we should have a specific briefing on the property tax mitigation for low-income homeowners issue, and just see what effects those might have on the city, and whether we should suggest amendments to them to make sure that to see if we could piggyback on them, or in some way piggyback on, for example, what the county's doing. That's come up as a major issue.
I will check into what's out there. We're still at a situation where not all of the bills have text written, full text submitted yet.
And my understanding, although the bill submittal date has passed, that some bills are still being submitted.
That's true, but also many legislators submitted the bill, but then it goes into legislative services to write the text, and that takes some time.
Right.
The final topic has been the large one that I've been dealing with for the past couple of weeks. It has to do with condominium conversion, and many legislators in Montgomery County are concerned with that issue. They're concerned in different ways and to different levels. The bill that Tacoma Park was pushing the hardest for, MC 61206, sponsored by Senator Grosfeld, has had a kind of a rough time. Nevertheless, it is substantially different than the other condominium bills. The other condominium conversion bills are tweaks of language. They are clarifying what is a disabled person. They are clarifying the way you determine income for low income. One of the ones that I think has, those have merit. One of the other ones that I think has a little bit more substantive merit has to do with giving some greater flexibility to a county, a municipality, or a housing agency in what they can do with an apartment building after they purchase it. because sometimes the rules related to that are very restrictive, and you may need more flexibility, such as with Hampshire Towers, where they ended up wanting to go with a split between condominium and rental. The current law does not allow the county to purchase a building that would then go to that kind of a split. So those are the kinds of things that are being addressed. Everyone is kind of spinning on this subject, and one of the things that became clear, the bill that we have been supporting is to only affect Montgomery County. It's considered a local bill. All of the other bills are statewide bills. For that reason, there's been a lot of, it's sometimes a little difficult to compare. It's not an apples-to-apples comparison. Also, there's a lot of concern about the technical provisions of the bill we supported, and if they would be in conflict with any of the other ones that are out there. I personally think there's very little in conflict between those, but I think that one of the things we have to do before the 2 weeks is up, when the Montgomery County delegation addresses this again, is really have a chart and an easy-to-understand presentation to the legislators so they can understand what each of these mini bills does and how they may or may not affect each other. And so that's something that I'm going to be trying to work with staff and others on, so that we are able to get that information out. I know you had a discussion, Mayor, with Steve Silverman over his concerns and his interests on the bill. Many people share those same kinds of questions and concerns.
Since this is coming back before the Montgomery County delegation in 2 weeks from Friday.
A week from Friday. A week from Friday.
A week from this coming Friday.
Yes.
2 weeks from last Friday. Yes, correct. I'm wondering if the council should get a more extended briefing and have a discussion about this, so we might be able to communicate the council's support or lack of support, whatever the council decides to do, to the delegation. My sense is that if it doesn't get, well, certainly if it doesn't get out of the delegation, it's not going anywhere.
Right.
But that's really the critical thing, is getting it out of the delegation rather than getting it through the entire legislature, or at least it's the first important thing. And I'm worried that it is in some danger.
Right. It didn't look good last Friday. But I think that, again, that's because we haven't had this information.
There were a lot of questions being raised to which answers were not immediately given.
Right.
And I think a lot of the people who would be inclined to support it didn't have the ammunition they needed to support it at that time. At the same time, I wasn't able to count heads. I couldn't tell where things were going with this. And so given that, affordable housing is one of our priorities, and given that condominium conversion is going to be one of the big issues in affordable housing, this might be something that the council should get up on, and we should get a briefing and maybe put together a letter to the members of the Montgomery delegation and send it to them prior to their meeting a week from Friday. Would the council be interested in doing that? Yes. Okay, I'm seeing sufficient interest that maybe we should. I don't know how I'm going to get it on next week's agenda. I'm looking at, I'm getting amazed looks from both the city manager and the city clerk about how we're going to cram it into next week's agenda. But I think that's the timing that we're under, and we have
confidence in you, Mayor.
and of course you don't mind meeting till 11 o'clock.
Can't seem to get away from it.
You won't mind if I don't fit it? Well, all right, I have one no and then several yeses, so I'm going to take that as a consensus yes. So what I'm saying to you, Suzanne, is that I'm thinking that perhaps we should have an extended briefing and council direction, and perhaps see if we can get something in, maybe even as early as next week.
Well, it has to be Monday.
Right.
There's not an option.
Right, as early as next week, yes.
So,
Tuesday, I'm sorry, Tuesday.
would we have public comment on the condo issue at this session? Because I know I'm going to have people who are going to want to talk about it.
If we did a formal resolution of support, yes, it would be something that would have public comment. And your suggestion, if I'm understanding your question, is that you're suggesting that we do it in that fashion?
Yeah.
Yes, I would request that we allow people to say their piece.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
Are you-
that's it, that's
Okay.
it. And there are other items, obviously, in the state legislature, but I'm not going to address further tonight. One of the things, though, that occurred to me as this session got underway is that a thing that is done at the county council that makes a lot of sense is that there's a standing session once a week during the legislative session where there's a briefing for the county council members so that they can give direction to their legislative staff, and it's very useful. One of the things that I was requesting is that every couple of weeks or whenever we see a need for that I am able to come back and give this information to you so that if there's a quick turnaround needed, I can get that direction from you.
Unless there's an objection to that, I'm going to try and squeeze that into the agenda. I agree with Suzanne.
You know, I had more than I would normally have because we haven't done it, but I would like to at least be able to give you a briefing on this information.
There's a number of issues of serious importance to the city, and we sort of need to be ready to do something if something needs to be done to protect our interests. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Colleen?
I just wanted to say that I have a lot of interest in the eminent domain issue and have a lot of background information on it, and I know
Great.
that the APA has a lot of support information for communities that are facing this. So if you get more eminent domain information, I'd like to be in the loop and
Absolutely.
might have some resources.
I'll pass. Like I said, there's quite a few bills on that, and I'm happy for your
Maybe you
help.
can be our eminent domain point person.
It is a pet professional issue for me. So.
And my assumption would be that you approach it from the same way Suzanne does.
Yeah, the public-private partnership is an important issue, and land, being able to consolidate land is such an important issue for cities. Unfortunately, my hometown even is one of the places that has abused eminent domain and taken perfectly decent, affordable starter units and turned them into malls. So, I mean, I understand why people are mad, but it's also a critical tool for cities.
Okay. I'm sure Suzanne would appreciate the assistance. It's not like she doesn't have enough to do this time.
Thank you.
Okay, is there anything else? If not, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Before
Suzanne,
11,
very much.
too.
All right, that's right, 5 minutes before 11.